We turn our attention to Samarkand, in the Zerafshan valley, as the Abbasid dawn rises over Sogdian walls. It is the year 780 of the Common Era. The muezzin has not yet called the Fajr prayer, but lamps already flicker in the paper workshops beneath the citadel of Afrasiab. A merchant from Changan, having crossed the Pamirs with his pack animals, sleeps now in the courtyard of a Caravanserai near the Oxus road. His bales of raw silk wait in the warehouse. By noon, Sogdian brokers will weigh them against silver dirhams minted in Baghdad. This is Samarkand, where the Tang frontier meets the Abbasid Caliphate, where Lapis from Badakhshan changes hands for porcelain from Zion, and where the old painted halls of Sogdian nobles still stand, their frescoes dim in the lamplight, even as new mosques rise in the suburbs beyond the walls. The Zerafshan Valley, October 751. You are standing at the edge of the irrigation channel as the first grey light begins to lift the darkness from the eastern ridges, and the mist that has gathered overnight is rising in thin ribbons from the water's surface, carrying with it the cold mineral scent of what appears to be snowmelt that may have travelled down from the Pamir Mountains through ancient channels. Around you, the packed earth of the road is still damp from the night's frost, and your breath shows faintly in the thin air of this high oasis, where the altitude keeps the mornings sharp, even when the days grow warm enough for the caravans to continue their journeys westward toward the Mediterranean, toward the distant Levant, toward the far terminus of routes that have carried goods and languages and beliefs across more than 6,400 kilometers of steppe and desert and mountain range. A door creaks open behind you, and then another, as the Caravanserai along the northern road begins to release its sleepers into the half-light. You turn to watch a Tang merchant emerge from the low doorway of the eastern wing, his quilted coat still fastened against the chill, his boots making soft impressions in the frost-rimed dust as he crosses the courtyard toward the storehouse where his goods have lain under lock and key through the dark hours. He carries a small bronze lamp, though its flame is barely visible now, and when he slides back the wooden bolt and enters the vaulted chamber, you follow at a distance that lets you observe without intruding upon the private ritual of a man taking stock of what remains of his fortune. The silk bales are stacked along the western wall, each one wrapped in waxed linen and marked with the chop of a workshop, possibly in Changan, with the weight and grade recorded in brushstrokes that appear to have survived long journeys across deserts and mountains to reach territories where Tang influence was contested. The merchant runs his hand along the nearest bale, feeling for dampness, for the telltale softness that would mean the ruin of months of travel and negotiation, and you can hear the faint rustle of the fabric within as he presses and releases, satisfied for now that the desert dryness has preserved what the humid valleys might otherwise have spoiled. The sky has shifted from grey to the palest rose where the sun will appear, and the mist is thinning into transparent veils that cling only to the lowest depressions of the land, to the ditches and the shadows beneath the mud-brick walls. From the direction of the southern gate comes the sound of voices gathering, and you walk toward them along a street that is beginning to show the texture of its construction, the right-angled paving that the old settlement of Afrasiab established as the pattern for this place long before the current generation of builders learned their trade. The stones are worn smooth in the center where generations of feet and hooves and cartwheels have passed, and rougher at the edges where fewer travelers have walked, and the morning light catches the irregularities in a way that makes the surface seem almost liquid, almost alive with the history of passage that it has witnessed since at least the time when Sogdiana was one of the upper satrapies of the Achaemenid Empire, when Persian administrators reportedly sent tribute eastward and may have received in return products from distant valleys. At the weighing house, the Sogdian brokers have already assembled, their cloaks thrown back now as the exertion of lifting and measuring warms their shoulders against the remaining chill. You stand among them, close enough to catch the smell of the oil they use to treat the leather of their boots, close enough to see the network of fine lines that the dry winds have etched around their eyes, the eyes of men who have spent their lives negotiating the transfer of goods between parties who never meet, who pass their silks and their spices and their silver through intermediaries like these, through stages of transaction that no single merchant ever traverses in full. For the Silk Road functioned largely as a network of segments, with many traders knowing only their own portion of the vast chain that stretched from China to the Mediterranean shores. The wooden scales clatter as the counterweights are set, and the soft ring of silver dirhams counted onto felt cloth provides a rhythm for the negotiations that will continue until the heat of midday drives the participants to seek shade and rest. An old man sits on a bench beside the weighing house, his fingers working a string of beads that have been polished to the color of honey by decades of handling, and he looks up as you pass, gestures with his chin toward the eastern horizon where the Pamir Mountains rise in a line of white that seems to float disconnected from the earth, too bright and too remote to be real. He speaks without preamble, as if continuing a conversation that you have already been having, describing the journey from Kashgar that he made in his youth, the 37 days of travel along the Chinese wall northwestward, the passage of the Taklamakan Desert where the dunes shift overnight and the landmarks that existed at morning have vanished by evening, the gradual ascent into air so thin that the blood pounds in the ears and the lamps burn blue and low. He mentions the Caravanserais where the Bactrian camels were fed and watered, the animals braying their complaint at the unfamiliar handlers, at the change of altitude, at the constant motion that their patient natures nevertheless resent in ways that show in the rolling of their eyes and the stamping of their broad, padded feet. His voice carries no urgency, no demand that you believe or respond, and you stand listening as the sun clears the ridge at last, sending a shaft of warmth across the valley that makes the frost steam briefly before it vanishes, that makes the watered earth release its held breath of minerals and decay and growth. The call to prayer begins from somewhere to your left, a voice trained to carry without shouting, to reach the faithful wherever they have paused in their morning occupations. You turn toward the sound and find its source in a building that shows the marks of recent construction, the mud plaster still lighter than the walls around it, the minaret lacking the weathering that softens the corners of older structures. This mosque has been built, you learn from a passerby who pauses to perform the brief ablutions at the fountain before entering, upon the foundation of an older fire temple, and the excavation of the site revealed layers of ash and burnt sandalwood that spoke of rituals performed here when the Sogdians, those Iranian peoples who formed an independent cultural sphere in Central Asia, maintained their own practices alongside the Zoroastrian traditions that had traveled eastward from the Persian heartlands. The new faith has not erased the old, the passerby remarks, gesturing toward a niche in the outer wall where a terracotta figure still guards a threshold that no longer leads anywhere, a remnant of the layered sacredness that this junction of roots has accumulated across the centuries. Children pass you on the street, carrying water in clay vessels that leave dark spots on their tunics where the moisture has seeped through the imperfect glazing. They move toward the southern gate, where you follow, drawn by the sound of picks and shovels against stone and earth. The repair crew that has been laboring since first light to restore the road after the spring floods that came down from the mountains with the melting snow, cutting channels through the packed surface, undermining the foundations of the walls that line the approach to the city. The foreman stands with his hands on his hips, watching the progress of his workers, and he nods to you without speaking, accepting your presence as he accepts the presence of any traveller who has business in this place, who belongs here by virtue of having arrived. The children set down their burdens at a cistern near the worksite, and one of them produces a parcel wrapped in linen, breaking off pieces of flatbread that have been baked in the tanner ovens of a household somewhere in the dense residential quarter that lies behind the citadel. The bread still warm enough to steam slightly when the wrapping is opened. The taste of it, when you accept the offered piece, a compound of smoke and grain, and the particular mineral tang of this valley's water, this valley's earth, this valley's air. You chew slowly, letting the bread dissolve against your palate, and you look back toward the center of the settlement that the world has come to call Samarkand, though its older name of Afrasiab still persists in the memories of those whose families have lived here across the generations that separate the present from the triangular form of the original settlement. The 220 hectares that once contained the citadel and the fortified city proper, the Shahrastan with its system of right-angled paved streets, and the corresponding residential complexes that excavations have revealed in such detail, the mosques and workshops among the urban structures that archaeologists uncovered and catalogued before the inscription of the site, as part of the UNESCO World Heritage recognition of Samarkand, a city long known to merchants, brokers, and travelers as a vital junction of transcontinental routes, where goods and ideas flowed between east and west. The foreman's voice rises briefly in instruction, then falls again into the pattern of observation that governs his morning. The repair crew works on, their tools rising and falling in a rhythm that matches the breathing of the valley itself, the slow inhalation of commerce and exhalation of departure that has characterized this place across the centuries of the Silk Road's greatest flourishing, from the 2nd century before the Common Era through the long span of exchange and conflict and accommodation that defines the relationship between the civilizations that meet here. You think of the battles that have been fought for control of this junction, the armies that have marched along the same roads that the merchants travel, the most recent of these confrontations still vivid in the memory of the old men who gather in the Caravanserais to talk away the evenings, the Battle of Talas in 751, a major confrontation involving Chinese and Arab forces in Central Asia, in which the Tang commander Gao Xianji faced the Abbasid general Ziyad ibn Salih alongside Karluk mercenaries, a battle that marked the end of Tang influence in Transoxiana and shifted the regional balance of power in an area long characterized by competing authorities. The name of the Tang commander passes through your thoughts as you watch the repair crew work, as you note the particular angle at which one of the younger laborers addresses the broken surface of the road, the concentration in his shoulders and the set of his jaw. The Abbasid victory at Talas has left its traces in the architecture of this place, in the mosque that rises beside the fire temple foundation, in the faces of the faithful who answer the call to prayer with movements that their grandfathers would not have recognized, in the very language of the contracts that the Sogdian brokers draw up at the weighing house, where Arabic script increasingly supplements the older scripts of the Iranian cultural sphere. Yet the continuity persists as well, the underlying patterns of trade and negotiation that outlast the particular empires that claim sovereignty over the routes, the fundamental reality of the Silk Road as a network of stages rather than a single journey, of goods passing through intermediate traders who know their own portion of the 6,400 kilometers and no more, who trust to the reputation of distant names and the reliability of established correspondence to complete the chains of transaction that connect the workshops of Chang'an to the markets of the Levant, the Mediterranean, the world beyond. The sun has climbed higher now, and the cold, thin air of early morning has begun to yield to a warmth that carries the smell of dust and watered earth in different proportions, the dust rising as the frost releases its hold on the surface particles, the earth breathing out the moisture that the irrigation channels have distributed through the night. You walk back toward the center of the settlement, past the weighing house where the Sogdian brokers have paused for refreshment, past the old man with his beads who has fallen silent now, his gaze fixed on the middle distance where memory and the present landscape merge into a single field of perception. The Tang merchant emerges from the Caravanserai with a companion, a younger man whose dress suggests the Persian Gulf rather than the Chinese coast, and they walk together toward the quarter where the money changers operate, their heads inclined toward each other in the posture of negotiation that you have observed 100 times in this place, in other places like it along the routes that follow the Chinese wall northwestward, that pass the Taklamakan Desert, that cross the Pamir Mountains and lead through Afghanistan toward the distant Levant, the distant Mediterranean, the distant terminus of journeys that few ever complete in their entirety. The flatbread has settled in your stomach, a warm presence that anchors you to this particular moment, this particular spot on the Earth's surface, even as your mind travels with the goods that are even now being transferred from one set of hands to another, from one mode of transport to another, from one language of contract to another. The Bactrian camels stir in their enclosure beyond the western wall, and their distant braying carries to you across the morning activity, a sound that has accompanied the silk road across the centuries of its greatest significance, from the 2nd century before the Common Era through the 13th century, and beyond, the complaint of animals that have borne the weight of silk and spice and precious metal across the distances that separate the producers from the consumers, the makers from the users, the known from the unknown. The silver dirhams ring softly onto felt cloth somewhere behind you, and the wooden scales clatter as they are adjusted for the next weighing, the next transaction, the next stage in the endless circulation that defines this place, that has defined it since the days of Afrasiab and before, since the days when Sogdiana was an upper satrapy of the Achaemenid Empire, when the Persian administrators first recognized the strategic value of this valley, this oasis, this junction of routes that control the passage between east and west. You find yourself at the edge of the residential quarter, where the right-angled streets of the old pattern still govern the layout of the houses and workshops, where the excavations of recent decades revealed the kilns and the looms and the forges that produced the goods that traveled outward along the same routes that brought the raw materials inward. A woman hangs dyed cloth across a railing, and the colors drip slowly onto the packed earth below, crimson and indigo, and the particular yellow that comes from the combination of local minerals with techniques imported from workshops thousands of kilometers away, carried by craftsmen who traveled with their knowledge as other men travel with their goods, who sold their skills at each stopping point along the journey from Xi'an to the Mediterranean, from the Chinese wall northwestward through the deserts and the mountains to this central place, this crossroads of cultures that travelers have recognized for millennia, that you recognize now in the quality of the light, the temperature of the air, the particular silence that falls between the sounds of activity, the pause that invites rest, that invites contemplation, that invites the slow dissolution of urgency into the longer rhythms of this place, this valley, this moment suspended between the departure and the arrival that define all journeys, all transactions, all lives that pass through the Zerafshan Valley on their way to destinations that remain, for most, forever unknown. The foreman's voice has ceased. The repair crew rests now, their tools laid aside, their bodies finding the shade of the wall that they have been mending. The children have carried their empty vessels homeward, and the smell of the tanner ovens reaches you again, fainter now, mixed with the midday dust that rises from every surface exposed to the climbing sun. Somewhere a dog sleeps in the angle of a doorway, its breathing visible in the slight movement of its flanks, its dreams inaccessible to you, as your own will soon be. as the dreams of all who pause in this place eventually become, carried outward on the routes that lead to the Pamir Mountains, to the Taklamakan Desert, to the Chinese wall that stretches northwestward toward horizons that blur now in the gathering warmth, that soften now in the lengthening of the afternoon into evening, into night, into the long, slow passage of darkness that brings the mist again to the irrigation channels, that brings the cold, thin air again to the faces of those who wake before dawn, who rise to check their inventories, to count their silver, to prepare for another day of the exchange that has never ceased, that will not cease, that flows through this valley like the water itself, like the breath of the sleepers in the Caravanserais, like the silence that descends now, gradually, gently, over the streets of right-angled paving, over the citadel and the Shahrastan, over the 220 hectares of Afrasiab and the larger settlement that has grown around it, over Samarkand where east met west and meets still, where the routes converge and diverge, where you stand now, where you rest now, where the afternoon settles into your shoulders like a hand placed in blessing, like the warmth of bread still wrapped in linen, like the closing of eyes that have seen enough for one day, that have earned their rest, that welcome the dimming, the slowing, the softening of all edges into the rounded forms of evening, into the hush that precedes the stars, the watchfulness of guards at gates, to the patient endurance of animals in stables, to the dreams of merchants calculating routes and risks in the privacy of their rest. The sky retains its darkness, yet the quality of that darkness alters, becoming less absolute, more yielding to what approaches. You are standing in the narrow street that climbs toward the citadel from the eastern gate, and the familiarity of this location after the night's wandering suggests how thoroughly the city has inscribed itself upon your attention, how completely its spaces have become your own. The air carries the mineral scent of sun-warmed adobe. Though the sun has not yet risen, the adobe still cool, the promise of warmth contained in the expectation rather than the actuality. Merchants are already assembling in the covered lanes beneath the fortress mound, unrolling carpets of deep blue wool upon which their samples will rest, until noon. The repetition of this preparation linking this morning to countless mornings past, to the continuity of commercial life that transcends individual participation. A man named Varkuman bends again over his wares, or perhaps this is another morning, another market day, the same gesture repeated in the same posture with the same unconscious expertise of 20 years negotiating between Chinese producers and Western consumers. His coat is cut in the Sogdian fashion, close at the waist and flaring over the hips, woven with a repeating pattern of pearl roundels that mark him as a man of substance in this city, where east met west and meets still. The particular squeak of unspun silk being tested between thumb and forefinger reaches your ears from a booth 3 paces ahead, and the sound, once heard, cannot be unheard, threading through your awareness like the continuous bass note of a composition that continues beneath its melodic variations. The morning progresses in its unhurried rhythm, and you understand now how this rhythm constitutes the city's true monument, more enduring than its walls, more significant than its accumulated wealth. The Sogdian language and script were used as a lingua franca along much of the Silk Road, and the sound of this script being scratched into wood, being spoken across counters, being sung in the formulas of greeting and negotiation, forms the acoustic environment within which all other activity occurs. You move among the merchants, and the particular squeak of unspun silk being tested between thumb and forefinger has ceased now, replaced by other sounds, other transactions, the continuous murmur of exchange that constitutes the city's vital function. The heat builds with the gradual inevitability of water finding its level, and the shadows withdraw to the narrowest strips beneath the awnings as the sun reaches its apex. Samarkand has grown wealthy on this trade, has grown distinct from its neighbors in the oasis belt, has grown into something the world depended upon without ever quite naming. The Sogdians formed an independent cultural and ethnic group distinct from their neighbors, and this independence expresses itself in 100 daily habits visible around you. The cut of a sleeve, the curve of a script, the gods invoked over a meal, the posture assumed in greeting, the interval maintained between speakers in conversation. These habits persist, reproduce themselves, transmit across generations through the medium of ordinary interaction, of children observing adults, of newcomers absorbing the expectations of established practice. The afternoon finds you ascending the slope toward the residential quarter, where houses cluster against the lower fortifications in a dense fabric of courtyards and overhanging upper stories. The complex perfume of wines spiced with cardamom and stored in leather bottles wafts from a drinking establishment near the Western Arcade, where men who have concluded their morning business refresh themselves before the afternoon's correspondence and calculation. The warmth of the day settles into the mud-brick walls, into the packed earth of the streets, into the very posture of the figures moving with slowed pace through the mounting heat. Samarkand absorbs this warmth as it has absorbed so many influences, transforming them into something unmistakably its own. You enter Varkuman's compound through the wooden gate carved with the boar's head emblem of his family, the motif repeated in the stucco relief of the interior walls. A servant leads you through the courtyard, past the shallow pool where lotus flowers float in the murky water, and into the reception hall that occupies the northern wing of the house. The warmth of a reception hall where wall paintings seem to glow in reflected lamplight enfolds you as you settle onto the cushions arranged along the western wall, the painted surfaces retaining a luminosity that suggests some quality in the pigments themselves, some technique of preparation that modern understanding has not recovered. The palace at Bunskikat, capital of Astrashana east of Sogdia, yielded major 7th-9th century wall paintings of comparable technique and subject matter, and scholars have traced connections between the workshops that served both centers. The afternoon light shifts through the clerestory windows, casting elongated rectangles of illumination that move with imperceptible slowness across the painted walls. You trace with your eyes the figure of a woman depicted in one of the banquet scenes, her posture active, her hand extended toward a musician, her garments arranged with the careful attention that indicates status and participation rather than passive attendance. Sogdian women were depicted in frescoes as active participants in banquets and ceremonies, and this representation confirms what documentary sources suggest about their roles in the social and economic life of these communities. The woman in the painting wears the high headdress characteristic of Sogdian fashion, its layered textiles creating a silhouette that would be recognizable across the trade routes, from Samarkand to the Sogdian quarters of Chang'an itself. Varkuman enters through a side door, having changed from his market coat into garments more suitable for receiving correspondence. He carries a letter, still sealed with the impressed clay of his cousin's trading house in Chang'an, and the import of this document shows in the careful manner with which he breaks the seal, in the slight tightening of his shoulders as he unfolds the thin paper. You observe his face as he reads, the movement of his eyes across lines written in the same Sogdian script his clerk employs, the same script that serves this dispersed community across distances that swallow months in transit. He sets the letter aside with a gesture that indicates he will study it further in private, and turns to the refreshment his servants have prepared. The resinous smoke of juniper in a Sogdian household shrine drifts through the chamber from a niche in the eastern wall, where a small fire burns before images that combine Iranian, Indian, and local deities, reflecting their cosmopolitanism. Varkuman murmurs a brief formula as he passes the shrine, a gesture of respect rather than fervent devotion, the habit of a man who maintains practice for the sake of continuity rather than spiritual urgency. Sogdian communities in China maintain their religious practices for generations after migration, and the persistence of such customs across thousands of miles suggests how deeply they were embedded in daily identity, in the rhythm of seasons and transactions, in the very structure of memory. Evening approaches with the softening of light that precedes true dusk in this latitude, and the household begins its transformation for the night's entertainment. Servants move through the reception hall with quiet efficiency, adjusting cushions, arranging low tables, preparing the spaces where guests will recline in the Sogdian fashion, propped on one elbow, free hand, extended for food and drink. Guests arrive with the gradual accumulation of footsteps in the courtyard, of voices exchanging greetings that modulate from the formal to the intimate according to established degree of acquaintance. The host emerges to receive them, and the company settles into the arrangement that etiquette prescribes. Evening brings a banquet in a private house. Musicians play the angular harp and long-necked lute, their instruments tuned to the intervals that Sogdian taste prefers, distinct from the Chinese scales to the east and the Hellenistic modes to the west. The angular harp speaks with a voice like rainfall on still water, its strings plucked in patterns that suggest both improvisation and deep tradition. The long-necked lute provides a buzzing continuo beneath, its frets adjusted to produce the microtonal slides that characterize this musical language. You feel the resonance in your chest as the players settle into their first extended composition, the notes seeming to inhabit the painted space, to animate the figures on the walls with suggested movement. Conversation flows with the wine, which is indeed spiced with cardamom and perhaps other aromatics less readily identifiable, stored in leather bottles that have imparted their own subtle contribution to its flavor. The guests discuss the rising power of the Abbasids and the recent battle by the Talas River, that engagement which has reshaped the political map of Central Asia, and with it, the conditions of trade that these men's livelihoods depend upon. The Abbasid revolution has displaced the Umayyad Caliphate, and the new dynasty's armies have demonstrated their capacity against Chinese forces at Talas, establishing a frontier that will channel and constrain the movements of goods and peoples for generations. Varkuman listens more than he speaks, his contributions measured, weighted with the consideration his position demands. His cousin's letter from Chang'an mentioned disruptions in the eastern markets, the aftermath of the Anlushan rebellion still working through the commercial networks, and he weighs this intelligence against the news from the west. The music continues, modulating now to a more animated mode that invites the entry of dancers. Living women now demonstrate the accuracy of those painted representations, their movements precise, their garments swirling in patterns that echo the figures on the walls around them. The Sogdian calendar combined Iranian and Chinese elements, and the timing of this gathering reflects that hybridity. The Iranian festival structure provides the occasion, but the detailed scheduling, the auspicious hours for particular activities, shows Chinese influence absorbed and naturalized. You watch the dancers as their feet trace complex patterns on the floor, their arms describing geometries in the lamplight. The banquet proceeds through its prescribed courses, each arrival announced by the change in musical mode, by the postures of the servants, by the vessels employed. The conversation turns from politics to more personal matters, to the health of distant correspondents, to the prospects of young people approaching marriageable age, to the condition of animals and equipment for the next season's caravans. A young woman enters the hall, perhaps 12 years of age, her bearing still coltish, unformed, yet with the watchful quality of one already learning to assess, to calculate. This is Varkuman's daughter, introduced to the company with the brief formality that acknowledges her presence without demanding attention. She carries a writing case and settles into a corner apart from the main company, opens the case, and prepares her materials by the light of a supplementary lamp. You move closer, unobtrusively, and observe the brush in her small hand forming characters with a competence that speaks of sustained instruction. Her brush pauses, resumes, traces the complex strokes of a poem or perhaps a mercantile document, the content less significant than the demonstration of skill, the embodied knowledge of another culture's written form. The banquet begins its slow dissolution as the hour grows late, guests departing with the elaborate choreography of leave-taking that establishes and reaffirms relationships. The musicians silence their instruments. The angular harp and long-necked lute return to their cases with the reverence due tools of such cultural importance. The painted walls receive the last flicker of lamplight as the flames are lowered, extinguished, and the warmth gradually yields to the cooler darkness of a house settling into night. Varkuman moves through the spaces of his dwelling with the final attentiveness of a man completing the day's obligations, checking seals, securing valuables, pausing at the household shrine to add a final pinch of incense to the dying fire. His daughter has completed her calligraphy practice and departed to her own chamber, the writing case left open to dry, the brushes cleaned and arranged with the precision that discipline requires. You find yourself in the courtyard, where the pool reflects a fragment of moon risen above the eastern wall, its surface disturbed only by the occasional rise of a fish to some invisible provocation. Samarkand surrounds you, the city that the Sogdians built and maintained, the node in a network without center, the place where east met west and meets still. The sky deepens toward the hours when even the most restless sleep, and the temperature drops with the desert's characteristic suddenness. You are standing in the courtyard of a Sogdian merchant's house, and the world this merchant inhabits extends far beyond any single city, any single lifetime, any single telling. The Sogdian calendar combined Iranian and Chinese elements, and its reckoning has brought you to this night, this pause, this threshold between the activity of consciousness and the restoration that follows. Varkuman's daughter sleeps now, her hands still perhaps retaining the muscle memory of brush strokes, her dreams perhaps populated by the characters she has learned. The moon moves higher, smaller, its light more austere as the night progresses toward its middle. You remain in the courtyard, in the city, in the world the Sogdians made and moved through, and the stillness envelops you as the darkness envelops the pool, as sleep envelops the household. Sogdian merchants acted as intermediaries between Chinese producers and Western consumers, and this role of mediation, of translation, of bearing goods and meanings across the spaces that separate, continues in forms these merchants could not have anticipated, through technologies they could not have imagined, toward ends they would recognize nonetheless. The first suggestion of tomorrow's light lies still below the horizon, yet the night has begun its imperceptible turn toward morning, the stars shifting in their accustomed paths. Samarkand breathes in its sleep, the city reduced to essential functions, to the watchfulness of guards at gates, to the patient endurance of animals in stables, to the dreams of merchants calculating routes and risks in the privacy of their rest. You are standing at the last water before the Zerafshan basin, where a thin stream threads between stones that have been polished by centuries of hooves and human hands. Around you, the darkness is lifting in layers, the sky above the eastern ridges shifting from iron to pearl to the palest imaginable gold. The cold air moves across your face, carrying the mineral scent of snow that lingers on peaks you cannot yet see. The rhythmic crunch of camel pads on gravel, a sound that continues in dreams, has stopped now, replaced by the softer noises of animals drinking and men speaking in low voices that carry no further than necessary. 3 camels stand apart from the others, their left forelegs bound in the hemp wrappings that indicate lameness, and the Arbabi Caravan moves among them with the deliberation of a physician, attending patients whose recovery will determine his own fortune. His name is Yusuf, and he has led caravans through the Pamir, crossing at altitudes exceeding 4,000 meters for 17 years, though the white that spreads through his beard suggests that fewer seasons remain ahead than behind him. He checks the swelling on the worst of the lame camels, running his palm down the tendons with the familiarity of a man who has spent more waking hours among Bactrian camels than among his own children. The caravan from Kashgar that pauses at this water represents a fragment of a journey that few merchants traveled in its entirety. Goods moved through relay trade across the 400-kilometer Silk Road, passing from hand to hand like stories that accumulate detail with each retelling. You understand this now as you watch the unloading of packs that will be transferred to fresh animals at Samarkand. The system of relay trade ensuring that no single merchant bore the full risk of the complete route from Chang'an. Porcelain from the kilns of Jingdezhen has traveled in these bundles, wrapped in straw and silk, and the route from China brought porcelain, silk, and spices westward through hands that added their percentage at each exchange. The return eastward carried primarily wool, gold, and silver, the balance of value tilting according to the hunger of distant markets for what each civilization produced in surplus. A young apprentice counts the days since leaving Chang'an, 247, marking the figure on a strip of paper that he keeps inside his coat against the warmth of his chest. He is 16, perhaps 17, his age known only to himself and to the uncle who arranged his placement with Yusuf's caravan. 247 days since leaving Chang'an, and the travel time from Chang'an to Samarkand typically required 8 months to a year, which means that the worst of the journey may finally lie behind him. His fingers find the paper again, confirming the count, as if the number itself were a talisman against the uncertainty of what waits in the valley below. The metallic taste of meltwater from snowfields, so cold it numbs the lips, fills the leather flask from which you drink, the water drawn from the pool where the stream gathers before continuing toward the Zerafshan river that you will follow to the city. Your tongue presses against the roof of your mouth, seeking warmth, finding only the persistence of that cold that seems to originate somewhere deeper than the water itself. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes for inspection. The Bactrian camels capable of carrying 200 to 300 kilograms, each standing with the patience of creatures who have learned that rest, however brief, must be fully inhabited. Each animal represents an investment measured in years of breeding and training, and the animal mortality on difficult passages could reach 30% in severe conditions, a calculation that haunts the Arbabi Caravan through every mountain pass and waterless stretch. 2 horses are missing from the string that left Kashgar, traded for grain at Osh when the original stores had spoiled in unexpected humidity. The transaction had been reluctant, the horses worth more than the millet they secured, but starvation respects no valuation, and the caravan had pressed on with bellies filled and prospects diminished. You remember the faces of the Osh traders, their expressions suggesting that they had witnessed such desperation before and would witness it again, the commerce of the road extracting its percentage from weakness as reliably as from strength. Seasonal travel was dictated by pasture availability and the avoidance of winter mountain passes, and Yusuf had delayed departure from Kashgar until the high meadows showed sufficient growth to sustain the animals through the most demanding elevations. The Pamir crossing required passage at altitudes exceeding 4,000 meters, and weather in the Pamirs could change within hours from clear skies to blinding snow, facts that governed every decision of timing and route with the rigidity of natural law. Water sources determined camping locations in desert and mountain stretches, the maps that men carried in their heads consisting less of fixed geography than of moving points where survival could be renewed, where the next stage became possible. The Taklamakan Desert had forced the caravan to choose between northern and southern ring routes, and Yusuf had selected the northern path, bringing them through Turfan and Kucha, oasis cities that served as essential staging posts where information could be exchanged and alliances renewed. At each of these waypoints, local rulers extracted transit taxes at multiple points along any given route, the accumulation of these levies representing a significant portion of the journey's total cost. Banditry and political instability required armed escorts or payment of protection fees, and the caravan had lost 2 guards to fever in the weeks between Kucha and Kashgar, their weapons redistributed among survivors whose vigilance could not compensate for reduced numbers. The deep ache in lower back and thighs that comes from 12 hours in a saddle resides in your body now as a constant companion, neither increasing nor diminishing, simply present as the ground is present beneath your feet. You shift your weight, seeking relief that does not come, knowing that the sensation will persist until true rest is permitted, perhaps days from now, perhaps longer. Other travelers move around you with the stiffness of shared affliction, the unspoken fellowship of those who have submitted their bodies to the demands of distance. Yusuf completes his inspection and stands alone, facing east where the sun has now cleared the ridge, its warmth still theoretical at this elevation, but promising transformation of the frozen air into something bearable. Caravan leaders held recognized status and legal responsibilities that extended beyond the practical organization of movement to the arbitration of disputes and the negotiation of safe passage through territories where their reputation served as currency more valuable than the silver they carried. Yusuf's name had opened gates that remained closed to lesser leaders, his word binding in settlements where formal law held no sway. The trust accumulated across 17 years of successful crossings, translating into privileges that newer arbabs could not claim. The metallic taste of meltwater from snowfields lingers still, transformed by the passage of time into something closer to memory than immediate sensation, yet persistent enough to remind you of all the streams that have sustained this journey. You watch the young apprentice fold his day count with deliberate care, 247 days since leaving Chang'an, the paper soft now from repeated handling and the moisture of his body. His face shows the composite expression of hope and exhaustion that marks those who have survived the middle of long endeavors, no longer able to recall clearly the circumstances of departure, not yet able to imagine the specifics of arrival. Animals stir and settle, the Bactrian camels shifting their weight in preparation for the final stage, their capacity diminished now by the 3 lame individuals who will require special attention on the descent. Yusuf has calculated that losing these 3 would reduce his profit to the margin where future credit becomes uncertain. He speaks to the apprentice in a voice too low for you to distinguish words, but the gesture that follows, a hand placed briefly on the young man's shoulder, suggests instruction that transcends the immediate task. The sudden green smell of irrigated fields after weeks of stone and dust reaches you before you can identify its source, carried upward on air currents that have passed through vegetation invisible from this vantage. Your nostrils flare, the olfactory recognition triggering a cascade of associations with softness and sustenance that the desert had gradually suppressed. Samarkand, the city that breathes in its sleep, possesses gardens famous across the Silk Road, the product of engineering that diverts mountain water through channels maintained across centuries of continuous habitation. At the crest of the final ridge, the green stripe of the Zerafshan Valley appears below, a band of intensifying color that seems almost luminous against the prevailing browns and grays of the terrain you have traversed. You stand with others who have paused in their preparations, the collective gaze directed downward at the destination that has existed as rumor and intention for so many days now made visible. The green stripe widens as your eyes adjust, revealing texture within the general verdure, the geometry of cultivation imposed upon natural contours. The rhythmic crunch of camel pads on gravel resumes as the caravan begins its movement, the descent requiring different skills from the ascent, greater care for loaded animals on uncertain footing. You find your position in the line, your own mount responding to pressure from knees and reins with the automatism of established habit. The deep ache in lower back and thighs merges with new demands, the angle of descent redistributing strain across muscles that had adapted to level or climbing ground. Travel time from Chang'an to Samarkand typically required 8 months to a year, and you calculate that the 247 days the apprentice has recorded falls comfortably within this span, suggesting reasonable progress despite the delays at Osh and the slower pace imposed by lame animals. Few merchants traveled the entire 400-kilometer Silk Road. Goods moved through relay trade precisely because the commitment of a full year exceeded what most trading operations could sustain, the capital locked in transit representing a cost that only the largest enterprises could absorb. Yet here you are, descending toward a city that has accumulated meaning through sheer duration of approach, the reality of arrival somehow less certain than the fact of ongoing movement. The sudden green smell strengthens as elevation decreases, becoming complex with the particular sense of specific crops rather than the generic promise of vegetation. You identify apricot, the characteristic fruit of this region, and something darker, perhaps the earth itself released from the desiccation that had compressed its aromatic possibilities. The remaining guards ride with visible relaxation, weapons still accessible, but no longer held in readiness, their attention shifting from threat assessment to the anticipation of payment and release. Local rulers extracted transit taxes at multiple points along any given route, and you anticipate the final collection at the gate, the last subtraction from value before the possibility of profit becomes real. The gates of Afrasiab open to permit entry before the market tax collector closes for evening prayer, the timing critical for caravans arriving late in the day, the bureaucratic day measured against religious obligation in a competition that merchants have learned to exploit. You see the walls now, the rose gold of approaching sunset, transforming mud, brick into something that seems to generate its own light, the color that will give this hour its name in the memories of those who survive to recall it. The gates of Afrasiab, the ancient foundation upon which Samarkand has accumulated its successive incarnations, represent a threshold between the law of the road and the law of settled authority, between the Arbabi Caravans' jurisdiction and the sovereignty of city magistrates. Yusuf rides ahead now, his posture altered by the approach to authority, the informal leadership of the trail, giving way to the formal presentation of documents and the negotiation of final charges. Caravan leaders held recognized status and legal responsibilities that included this moment of translation, the conversion of mobile commerce into stationary wealth, the protection of his investors' interests against the competing claims of tax collectors and warehouse agents. His name will be entered in registers alongside the origin and declared value of his cargo, the record serving both as permit and as the basis for future taxation should the same goods prove unsold. The metallic taste of meltwater from snowfields has faded entirely now, replaced by the dry warmth of air that has passed over sun-heated earth and human habitation, carrying the composite signature of civilization that distinguishes city from wilderness. Your lips no longer numb, your thirst assuming the ordinary character of arrival rather than the desperate edge of scarcity. You think of the young apprentice, 247 days since leaving Chang'an, and wonder whether he will remain in Samarkand or continue westward with another caravan, his accumulated experience now qualifying him for positions of greater responsibility. The return eastward carried primarily wool, gold, and silver, and you observe the loading platforms where such cargoes await transport in the opposite direction, the symmetry of exchange that sustained this commerce across millennia. The route from China brought porcelain, silk, and spices westward, and the bundles that have survived the journey intact will command prices reflecting not merely intrinsic value, but the cost of their conveyance, the premium of rarity compounded by the premium of difficulty. Porcelain from the kiln districts, silk from the mulberry groves, spices from the tropical south, each layer of origin adding to the narrative that merchandise acquires through movement. The exhausted travelers make the final descent as sunset turns the city walls rose gold, the color deepening as the sun approaches the horizon, the effect intensifying rather than diminishing as darkness gathers above. You are among them, your own exhaustion acknowledged now that arrival is certain, the suppression of fatigue during uncertainty no longer necessary or possible. The deep ache in lower back and thighs demands recognition, insists upon the rest that has been deferred through will and necessity. The rhythmic crunch of camel pads on gravel changes timbre as the surface transitions from mountain debris to the prepared approach of a maintained road, the sound becoming more regular, almost ceremonial in its predictability. Animals sense arrival, the Bactrian camels quickening their pace despite their loads, scenting perhaps the stable and the feed that await, the reward for function performed. 3 camels remain lame, their contribution to this caravan concluded, their future depending upon the veterinary knowledge available within the city or the mercy of owners calculating replacement cost against recovery probability. At the gates of Afrasiab, the process of entry unfolds with the deliberate pace of institutional routine, each document examined, each declaration compared against visible cargo, each tax assessed according to tables that have achieved the fixity of tradition. The market tax collector works with the knowledge that evening prayer approaches, his calculations gaining urgency without sacrificing precision, the religious obligation that will interrupt his labor serving as deadline rather than distraction. You watch Yusuf negotiate, his bearing combining deference and confidence in proportions calibrated to the status of his interlocutor, the performance of social identity that enables commerce across boundaries of language and custom. Weather in the Pamirs could change within hours from clear skies to blinding snow, and you retain the visceral memory of such transition, the scramble to protect animals and goods while vision failed and temperature plummeted. The sudden green smell of irrigated fields becomes overwhelming as you pass through the gate, the gardens within the walls achieving concentrations of vegetation impossible in the surrounding aridity, the engineering of water distribution demonstrating what concentrated human effort could accomplish against natural limitation. You breathe deeply, filling lungs that have adjusted to thin mountain air with the humid density of cultivated valley, the metabolic adjustment as demanding in its way as the physical transition from altitude. Samarkand receives you, the city that breathes in its sleep, now stirring toward evening activity, the gates of Afrasiab having admitted another fragment of the continuous flow that sustains its prosperity. The green stripe of the Zerafshan valley that appeared at the ridge crest has resolved into streets and quarters, the abstract promise of destination becoming particular in the details of architecture and human presence. You follow the caravan to its designated quarter, the route predetermined by custom and by the relationships that Yusuf has cultivated across his 17 years of passage. 2 horses traded for grain at Osh, 3 camels lame, 2 guards lost to fever, the inventory of diminishment that accompanies any successful journey, the subtraction from ideal that defines the actual. The young apprentice walks beside you now, his day count completed, 247 days since leaving Chang'an, transformed from measure of endurance into measure of accomplishment. The strip of paper now a record to be preserved rather than a talisman against uncertainty. His face shows the strange emptiness that follows the completion of long purpose, the moment before new purpose is discovered or imposed. You are among the exhausted travelers, your own arrival participating in the general pattern, your individual story subsumed into the collective narrative of the road. The metallic taste of meltwater from snowfields persists only in memory, replaced by the ordinary sensations of city existence, the availability of water without the preceding anxiety of scarcity. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes for the last time on this journey, the transfer to warehouse or market representing the final stage of a process that began in distant origins. Yusuf completes his formalities and returns to his people, his responsibilities continuing until the last animal is stabled and the last dispute arbitrated. The recognized status and legal responsibilities of his position, extending beyond the moment of arrival into the settlement of accounts and the planning of eventual return. His name will be spoken in the warehouses where credit is arranged, the reputation that opened gates on the road, now opening doors in the commercial quarter, the network of trust that constitutes the true map of Silk Road commerce. Night falls over Samarkand, the rose gold of sunset yielding to the blue depths of evening, the city continuing its essential functions beneath stars that have observed this pattern across centuries of continuous habitation. You find a place to rest. The deep ache in lower back and thighs finally permitted the stillness that will transform it from active discomfort to the dull memory of effort expended. The rhythmic crunch of camel pads on gravel accompanies your descent into sleep, the auditory trace of movement persisting after movement has ceased, the body traveling in imagination what it no longer travels in fact. The sudden green smell of irrigated fields returns as olfactory hallucination, the promise of arrival becoming arrival itself, the distinction between journey and destination dissolving in the chemistry of rest. Samarkand surrounds you, the city that breathes in its sleep, and you breathe with it, your own essential functions slowing toward the restoration that permits continuation, the pause that enables the next beginning. The young apprentice sleeps nearby, his paper put away, his counting concluded, his future undetermined, but no longer entirely constrained by the immediate necessity of survival. The gates of a Afrasiab that opened to permit entry before the market tax collector closed for evening prayer have closed behind him, the threshold crossed, the passage complete. The rose gold light achieves the fixity of icon, the visual summary of an experience too various for sequential memory. You sink deeper, the sound of the city becoming indistinct, the particular giving way to the general hum of human presence that signifies settlement, community, the end of isolation. The metallic taste of meltwater from snowfields makes one final appearance, the last sensory anchor releasing its hold, permitting the complete transition from the vigilance of travel to the surrender of sleep. Samarkand breathes in its sleep, and you breathe with it, the city and the traveler temporarily united in the fundamental rhythm of organic existence, the commerce of the day suspended until the commerce of the next day resumes, the continuous cycle that preceded your arrival and will continue after your departure. The deep ache in lower back and thighs gradually diminishes, the body beginning its slow repair, the restoration that will prepare for whatever movement tomorrow requires. The rhythmic crunch of camel pads on gravel fades at last into silence, the dream itself becoming indistinguishable from the sleep that contains it, the journey completing its transformation into pure memory, into the substance from which narrative will eventually be shaped. But for now, simply rest, simply the absence of forward motion, simply the peace of arrival. You are standing in the threshold of a great walled courtyard as the last amber light withdraws from the eastern parapets. Above you, the sky deepens through layers of violet toward the familiar darkness that will govern the next 8 hours. The Persian term *Caravanserai* combines *Carwan*, meaning caravan, and *Serai*, meaning house or palace, and this etymology reveals itself in every dimension of the structure that now encloses you. You feel the weight of that compound word as the heavy wooden gates swing inward on iron hinges, their surfaces reinforced with diagonal braces of seasoned oak. The gates meet with a soft concussion of timber against timber, and the horizontal beam is dropped into its brackets by 2 gatekeepers whose movements suggest long practice. The first lantern is lit somewhere along the upper gallery, then another, then a third, until a constellation of warm points defines the perimeter of the enclosed space. You watch the flame shadows stretch and contract across the plastered walls, which have been whitewashed to reflect what little illumination the wicks provide. The particular acoustics of voices in a courtyard enclosed by high walls begin to assert themselves, carrying ordinary speech upward in unexpected clarity, so that a murmured conversation near the fountain reaches your ears with the intimacy of whispered confidence. Around you, the merchants are unloading their final cargoes for the day, the bales of silk, and the nested ceramics, and the leather sacks whose contents remain unidentified by any label. The cold air moves across your face, carrying with it the first suggestion of dew that will later gather on every exposed surface. A merchant from Baghdad argues softly with a Khurasani banker over the exchange rate for silver, their voices rising and falling in the measured cadence of negotiation that neither party wishes to escalate into open dispute. You observe them from a respectful distance, noting how the Baghdad merchant gestures with his left hand, while his right remains concealed within the folds of his robe, perhaps upon a purse, perhaps upon nothing at all. The Khurasani banker listens with his head inclined at a precise angle, neither agreeing nor rejecting, allowing the mathematics of their disagreement to suspend between them like a thread of spider silk in still air. You drift closer, drawn by the warmth of the argument more than its content, and you catch the repeated invocation of a ratio, 30-1, 31, the numbers themselves becoming a kind of incantation against the settling night. Caravanserais were walled structures providing secure lodging for travelers, animals, and goods, and the security thus provided manifests in the gradual relaxation you witness around you. Men who have ridden 12 hours with weapons ready now permit their shoulders to descend from the defensive posture of the road. Animals whose nostrils have flared at every unfamiliar scent now lower their heads to mangers with something approaching domestic calm. The courtyard, which during daylight hours presented itself as a site of commercial urgency, assumes in this hour a different character, becoming instead a temporary village complete with all the small rituals of established settlement. Large caravanserais functioned simultaneously as warehouses and trading venues, and you can trace this dual purpose in the architectural disposition of the spaces that surround you, the ground level given over to storage and transaction, the upper levels reserved for the more vulnerable cargo of human rest. In the stable bay, which extends along the entire northern wing of the structure, a groom rubs liniment into the shoulders of a limping camel. You approach slowly, recognizing that any sudden movement might startle the beast and undo the careful progress of this ministration. The camel's breathing is audible, a slow bellows rhythm that fills the stable with its presence. The groom works without speaking, his hands moving in patterns learned from his own apprenticeship, perhaps decades prior, perhaps in a stable not unlike this one hundreds of leagues to the east or west. You smell the liniment, sharp with camphor and something else, some regional herb whose name you do not know but whose properties the groom trusts implicitly. The mingled smells of animal urine, straw, cooking oil, and unwashed wool clothing envelop you as you stand there, not unpleasantly, but with the overwhelming density of a lived environment, a place where biological necessity has not been segregated from human aspiration, but accepted as its foundation. The typical layout featured a central courtyard surrounded by arcaded galleries, and this regular geometry becomes more apparent as your eyes adjust to the limited light. You walk now along the ground-level colonnade, your fingers trailing across the stuccoed columns, feeling the slight irregularities where repairs have been made, where the original construction yielded to the pressures of time and weather and the simple accumulated weight of passing centuries. Each arch frames a portion of the night sky, and you pause to appreciate how this architectural rhythm divides the heavens into manageable sections, as if the infinite could be domesticated through repetition and proportion. Stabling areas occupied the ground floor, human quarters were above, and you observe this vertical hierarchy in the distribution of sounds, the heavier movements of beasts below, the lighter footfalls of those seeking sleep in the chambers overhead. Two travelers share tea and dried apricots, comparing the road conditions from Merv, and you find yourself invited to join their circle without formal introduction, the fellowship of the road superseding the usual protocols of acquaintance. The tea has been brewed strong and sweet, the sugar dissolved while the water still boiled, and it coats your tongue with a warmth that spreads gradually through your chest. The apricots have been halved and dried in the sun until their flesh concentrates into something almost medicinal, something that restores what the day's exertions have depleted. The travelers speak of the stretch between Merv and this caravanserai, of a washed bridge that required careful ford, of bandit signs observed in a particular defile, of the relative merits of the northern and southern variants of the same route. You contribute little, finding satisfaction in the mere act of listening. In the reconstruction of a landscape, you have not yourself traversed through the testimony of those who survived its challenges. The cooling of flagstone floors as night advances draws warmth upward into the dark, and you become aware of this thermal transfer through the soles of your feet, through the thin leather that separates your skin from the stone. The floor was warm when you arrived, saturated with the solar accumulation of August afternoon, but now it releases that stored energy gradually, passively, like a body settling into sleep. You shift your weight from foot to foot, appreciating the diminishing reservoir of heat, the way the material world records, and then relinquishes its impressions of the day just concluded. Above, the stars have emerged in sufficient number to suggest the vastness beyond the walls, though the lantern light obscures all but the most determined celestial bodies. Caravanserais were often endowed by rulers or wealthy patrons as charitable foundations, and somewhere in this structure, perhaps in the inscription above the main gate, now invisible in darkness, perhaps in a dedicatory plaque within the prayer niche, the name of such a benefactor persists. You consider the motives that might prompt such endowment, the accumulation of merit, the cultivation of reputation, the simpler satisfaction of providing for strangers in a landscape that otherwise offered little hospitality. Free lodging for 3 days was customary in many Islamic-era caravanserais, a generosity that assumed its own reciprocity, the traveler who benefited becoming in turn an advocate for the route, a carrier of news regarding its safety and comfort, a participant in the network of information that sustained long-distance commerce. The gift of shelter propagated itself through the mouths of those sheltered, an economy of gratitude that required no coin but generated value nonetheless. A scholar copies astronomical tables by lamplight in a corner of the common room, and you drift toward this concentration of illumination as a moth might, drawn less by the specific activity than by the mere fact of deliberate focus in an hour of general dispersal. The scholar's pen moves with the regularity of ritual, each character formed with identical pressure, identical slant, the copy emerging as faithful duplicate of whatever manuscript serves as his source. You do not disturb him with questions, recognizing in his posture the inviolability of scholarly absorption, the temporary withdrawal from social availability that copying requires. The lamplight pools across his pages, leaving his face in partial shadow, and you note how this lighting reproduces conditions unchanged since the first such transcriptions were undertaken, the technology of illumination having advanced only incrementally across the centuries of such labor. The astronomical tables contain, you presume, the positions of stars for particular latitudes and dates, the information necessary for navigation, both terrestrial and spiritual, for the calculation of prayer times and the orientation of sacred architecture. Water supply came from wells, cisterns, or dedicated canat channels, and the sound of moving water reaches you now from the courtyard center, where a fountain maintains its modest circulation even at this hour. You walk toward it, guided by the liquid murmur, and find the basin filled to its rim, the overflow channel carrying excess into some subterranean destination. You cup your hands and drink, the water carrying the faint mineral taste of its underground passage, the coolness startling against your palms. The canat, if this is indeed the source, represents engineering of remarkable ingenuity, the gentle slope that conveys water across miles of desert without pumping, without the consumption of fuel, relying solely upon gravity and the patience of those who first traced its course through unmarked terrain. You wipe your hands against your garments and continue your circuit of the courtyard. Security was maintained by guards and the physical isolation of the courtyard from exterior access, and you observe now the embodiment of this principle in the single controlled point of entry, the windows that open only upon the interior, the thick walls that would resist any but the most determined assault. The guards themselves move in patterns you cannot fully predict, appearing at intervals along the parapet, descending to verify the integrity of the gate, returning to some station where warmth and companionship mitigate the tedium of vigilance. Their presence does not oppress but reassures, the knowledge of protection permitting the relaxation that the exhausted traveler requires. You nod to one as he passes, and he responds with a gesture that might be recognition or might be merely professional courtesy, the acknowledgement of a legitimate guest by one charged with distinguishing legitimacy from its opposite. Cooking facilities were communal. Travelers prepared their own food or purchased from attached kitchens, and the evidence of this arrangement surrounds you in the form of smoke wisps, of residual aromas, of the occasional clatter of implements being cleaned and stored for the following day. You have eaten already, but the ambient promise of further sustenance comforts, the knowledge that need will not outrun provision in this enclosure. Some travelers gather still around the hearths, prolonging their meals into social occasion, the food itself becoming pretext for the conversation that digestion permits. Others have retreated to their allotted chambers, preferring solitude to company, the horizontal plane to the vertical posture of eating. You occupy a middle position, neither joining the lingering diners nor seeking immediate rest, content in this interval of undefined status. Religious practice was accommodated through small prayer niches or attached mosques, and you notice now, as your attention settles into finer discrimination, the directional indication embedded in the architecture, the subtle alignment that orients the attentive observer toward the holy cities. The prayer niche in the common room, modest in its scale, contains a single lamp maintained against the hour of devotion, its flame steady in the undisturbed air. You observe the scholar interrupt his copying to perform ablution at the fountain, his movements economical and devout, the transition from intellectual to spiritual labor accomplished without visible friction. He returns to his astronomical tables with the same concentration he brought to his prayers, as if both activities participate in a single encompassing discipline, the study of celestial order and its acknowledgement through ritual gesture. The distant howl of jackals beyond the walls reaches you now, a sound that carries with it the entire wilderness this structure temporarily excludes. Answered by the nervous shifting of tethered horses, the call establishes a dialogue between domesticated and wild that has continued since the first such enclosures were raised against the darkness. You listen to the horses settle, to the grooms speaking soft reassurance, to the gradual restoration of equine calm. The jackals will prowl the perimeter, you know, testing for vulnerability, for some breach in the defensive system. But finding none, they will eventually abandon this particular site for more promising opportunity. The cycle of threat and response, of predator patience and prey vigilance, continues in registers below human consciousness, the ancient choreography of survival. Caravanserai served as information exchanges where news and prices circulated, and even at this hour, you overhear fragments of intelligence passing between men who would disavow any formal role in such transmission. The price of indigo in Damascus, the succession dispute in some provincial capital, the condition of roads not yet traveled by those who speak of them, all circulate in the manner of rumor, acquiring detail and certainty through repetition, losing accuracy in the same process. You do not seek to verify any particular report, understanding that the value of such exchange lies less in its factual content than in its maintenance of connection, its proof that the dispersed communities of the road remain linked by threads of mutual interest. The merchant from Baghdad and the Khurasani banker have concluded their dispute, or suspended it, and now share with others the intelligence each acquired in separate markets, their earlier antagonism forgotten in the larger project of mapping commercial possibility. Before midnight, the watchman makes his rounds, his footsteps echoing on the stone, arcade with a regularity that itself becomes a form of reassurance, the auditory marker of institutional continuity. You track his progress by sound alone, the approach along the eastern wing, the pause at the corner, the continuation along the southern elevation, the verification of each portal, each potential point of vulnerability. His footsteps carry the particular resonance of leather against stone, a sound distinct from the barefoot passage of indoor movement, the heavier tread of booted urgency. You do not see him, remaining yourself in shadow while he moves through the limited circles of lamplight, but his presence structures your awareness of the hour, the approach of midnight marked by this circumambulation as surely as by any mechanical chronometer. Repair services for pack animals and equipment were commonly available, and you observe evidence of this provision in the morning's residue, the discarded horseshoe nails, the coils of replaced rope, the leather scraps from some harness adjustment undertaken with the urgency of departure preparation. The limping camel you witnessed earlier represents only the most visible instance of maintenance need, the entire ecology of transport requiring continuous attention, the replacement of what fatigues, the reinforcement of what strains. You run your own hand along the strap of your personal baggage, finding the wear points by touch, noting where your own equipment will soon require similar intervention. The availability of such services distinguishes the established route from its alternatives, the infrastructure of support as crucial as the physical path itself. Medical treatment for travelers could be obtained from local physicians or barber surgeons, and though you require no such attention, the knowledge of its availability contributes to your sense of security, the reduction of anxiety that permits genuine rest. Somewhere in this structure, perhaps in the chamber adjacent to the kitchen, perhaps in some upper room whose location you have not yet determined, the instruments of medical intervention await their occasional employment. The barber surgeon, if one is presently in residence, combines functions that modern specialization would separate, the extraction of teeth and the lancing of boils, and the letting of blood, according to humoral theory, all falling within his competence. You hope not to require his services, but appreciate the cultural logic that places healing within reach of those who journey, the recognition that distance from home amplifies vulnerability to bodily disorder. The largest caravanserais might shelter several hundred travelers simultaneously, and though you cannot estimate with precision the population of this particular night, you sense the press of multiple presences, the cumulative breath and warmth and dreaming of a considerable company. You are not alone, have never been alone in this structure, and this knowledge modifies your experience of the darkness, transforming potential isolation into collective rest, the shared surrender of consciousness that the night permits. Some of your fellow travelers have already succumbed, their snoring audible through the thin partitions, their dreams perhaps converging with yours in some shared substrate of fatigue and relief. Others maintain wakefulness as you do, the stubborn alertness of those whose bodies have not yet accepted the permission that the environment offers. The mingled smells that have surrounded you since your arrival have by now become so familiar as to approach invisibility, your olfactory adaptation rendering this compound atmosphere as neutral as the air of any other dwelling. Only the occasional intensification alerts you to some particular source, the fresh contribution of a newly arrived beast, the reheating of some residual cooking, the opening of a traveler's pack to release the compressed essences of long carriage. You breathe deliberately, attempting to recover the initial impact of this olfactory landscape, and succeed only partially, the threshold of perception having shifted to accommodate what initially overwhelmed. This adaptation, you recognize, mirrors the larger process of acclimatization that travel requires, the gradual transformation of strangeness into familiarity through sustained exposure. You find yourself now in the upper gallery, the lanterns having diminished to a smaller number as fuel conservation dictates the extinguishing of non-essential light. Your chamber awaits, its door ajar, its interior black with the particular blackness of windowless interior space. You hesitate on the threshold, reluctant to surrender the limited visibility that the corridor provides, the last prospect of human movement before the privacy of sleep. Around you, the voices in the courtyard have reduced to isolated utterance, to dream murmur, to the silence that precedes or follows speech without clear distinction. You lean against the gallery railing, looking down into the courtyard where a single lantern still burns near the fountain, its reflection trembling in the water surface, its flame bending in some imperceptible draught. The scholar has extinguished his lamp, his astronomical tables protected against the dew that will gather before dawn. The merchant from Baghdad and the Khurasani banker have retired to separate quarters, their unresolved dispute suspended in the knowledge that morning will provide opportunity for its continuation or its abandonment. You feel again the compound identity of this place, the grandeur of the *Caravanserai* concept contained within the functional simplicity of its execution. You are not in a palace, yet something of palatial intention survives in the proportions of the courtyard, in the dignity of the arcades, in the very persistence of the structure across the centuries of its utility. You are part of a caravan, though your particular group will disperse with the morning, each traveler resuming individual destination, individual purpose, the temporary solidarity of the road dissolving as it formed, without ceremony or regret. The house, the palace, the *Sarai* remains, receiving tomorrow's arrivals as it received you, as it received the generations prior, the continuity of hospitality transcending the transience of those whom it shelters. You enter your chamber at last, the darkness complete, the sounds of the Caravanserai reduced to their essential substrate, the breathing of sleepers, the occasional movement of beasts, the eternal whisper of water in its subterranean course. You locate your resting place by tactile exploration, the folded bedding, the pillow of stuffed leather, the rough textile that will serve as covering against the night's advancing coolness. Here the thermal trajectory reverses, your own body heat contributing to the ascending flow rather than receiving it from below. You arrange yourself for sleep, the posture of the traveler who has learned to rest in any circumstances, upon any surface, with the mental techniques that permit rapid descent into unconsciousness. The watchman completes another round, his footsteps echoing on the stone arcade, their approach and recession marking the interval before midnight, the interval after, the progression of hours you will not yourself witness in waking consciousness. You listen until the sound itself becomes indistinguishable from the pulse in your ears, the internal rhythm that will persist when all external reference has ceased. The mingled smells of the day accompany you into the threshold of sleep, becoming the olfactory signature of a place you will remember without deliberate effort, that will return unbidden in subsequent nights of rest, in other circumstances, other architectures. You do not resist this imprinting, accepting it as the natural consequence of sustained presence, the body's recording of environment that precedes and exceeds conscious documentation. You calculate your own entitlement against the customary 3 days, the duration of permitted stay measured against the requirements of your journey, the balance between rest and advance that each traveler must negotiate individually. You will not exceed the customary limit, will depart with the gratitude of one who has received more than was strictly necessary, the generosity of the institution acknowledged in your eventual payment of its implicit debt, the recommendation to others, the return if routes permit, the memory preserved against the erasure of mere passage. The 3 days establish a rhythm, a miniature life within the larger span of movement, the temporary settlement that refreshes the capacity for subsequent wandering. You hear again, in imagination, the fountain's murmur, the liquid foundation upon which all other activities of this place depend. Without water, there would be no Caravanserai, no oasis of rest in the traversable wilderness, no possibility of the concentrated population you have briefly joined. The Kanat channels represent a commitment across generations, the initial excavation and the subsequent maintenance demanding coordination beyond any individual lifespan, the institutional continuity that parallels the architectural persistence of the walls themselves. You drink once more in memory, the water's coolness recalled upon your tongue, the mineral taste that identified its subterranean origin. You number yourself now among the anonymous multitude this place shelters, your individual presence leaving slight trace, the compression of bedding, the evaporation of moisture upon stone, the gradual dissipation of body heat into the surrounding mass. Yet you have been here, will have been here, the fact establishing its modest claim upon the history of this place, its participation in the accumulated weight of human passage that gives the Caravanserai its density, its gravity, its capacity to draw subsequent travelers into its enclosing embrace. Sleep approaches with the gentleness of water finding its level, the unconsciousness that is also arrival, also the completion of a day's movement toward this horizontal suspension. You feel the transition as gradual yielding, the alertness that has sustained you through the evening's observations relaxing into something less defended, more permeable to the suggestions of dream. You are lying now in the absolute darkness of the chamber, the Caravanserai around you continuing its nocturnal existence in registers you will not share, the watchman's footsteps having faded beyond the range of waking attention, the fountain's murmur subsiding into the blood's own circulation, the jackals withdrawn to whatever dens they occupy until the next night's prowl. Sleep takes you gradually, as the gates took you at evening, with the softness of timber meeting timber, the horizontal beam of unconsciousness dropping into its brackets, securing you against the wilderness that waits beyond these walls for the morning's departure, for the resumption of movement, for the eventual crumbling of all that presently protects. For now, there is only this, the body horizontal, the mind descending, the repair beginning that will prepare for whatever tomorrow requires, the peace of arrival held intact until arrival itself dissolves into the deeper arrival of dreamless rest. Cold stone beneath you still holding the day's heat in its deeper strata, the surface already cooling toward the temperature of the hour before dawn. Somewhere a mule shifts its weight in the stable block, the creak of leather and the soft exhalation of breath traveling through the courtyard on currents of air too subtle to feel against your skin. The darkness is complete here, the kind that existed before lanterns, before any human attempt to partition night from itself, and you are held within it as the chamber holds you, as the Caravanserai holds the chamber, as the desert holds the Caravanserai in its vast, indifferent palm. Morning arrives without announcement, merely a gradual complication of the darkness into grey, into the colour of dust suspended in water, into the pale rose that precedes actual sunlight. You are standing at the weighing house as the first proper light touches the eastern lintel, the stone there warming from grey to tan, while shadows remain pooled in the corners like something spilled and forgotten. Around you, the merchants are unloading their cargoes from the night's arrivals, the bundles lowered with the particular care that accompanies goods whose value exceeds the value of the men who carry them. A broker from Samarkand tests a bundle of Chang'an silk thread against a standard measure, the slipknot tightening as he draws the cord through his fingers, the slippery coolness of raw silk thread running through the fingers like water, like something that cannot be held completely, that escapes even as it is grasped. He notes the result on a wax tablet, the stylus scratching with a sound like insect movement, and the measure is recorded, the silk from Chang'an passing this first examination before the greater examinations still to come. The air carries the mineral sharpness of cold stone warming rapidly, the night chill retreating into the shaded places where it will linger until noon, where it will wait for evening to reclaim what the sun has temporarily surrendered. Dust rises from the courtyard in thin columns where feet disturb it, each column collapsing slowly back to the ground in its own time, in no hurry, as if demonstrating that all elevation is temporary, all settling merely delayed. You watch a man from Cotton lead a string of Bactrian camels toward the water trough, their double humps swaying with the rhythm of their deliberate pace, the bells around their necks making a sound too low to be called music, too structured to be mere noise. At the far end of the weighing house, a jeweller from Balk has spread his wares across a carpet dyed with madder root to a colour between rust and dried blood, a colour chosen to make certain stones appear more vivid by contrast. He displays Lapis cylinders, their pyrite inclusions glinting like captured stars, like fragments of some celestial map, dropped into the mineral and frozen there during the slow geological processes that made them. The particular blue of highest-grade Lapis, so intense it seems to absorb surrounding light, gathers the available illumination into itself and returns nothing, a generosity of color that asks no reciprocation. The mineral composition of Lapis lazuli typically includes lazurite, pyrite, calcite, and may contain minor amounts of other minerals such as diopside and sodalite. He speaks of Badakhshan, where Lapis lazuli was mined from antiquity, where the tunnels follow seams laid down when the land that would become northeastern Afghanistan was still assembling itself from marine sediments and volcanic intrusions, when the world was younger and more pliable to the forces that shaped it. Badakhshan shares borders with Tajikistan, Pakistan, and China, and this geography of edges has historically made it a place where trade routes converge and valuable minerals have been extracted and transported. The jeweler turns a cylinder in his fingers, the pyrite catching the morning light that now enters fully through the eastern doorway, the weighing house transformed from shadow into a space of visible transactions, of examinations and negotiations conducted in the shared vocabulary of goods and standards. Noon arrives with the weight of accumulated hours, the sun positioned overhead in a sky that has burned from morning rose to the hard pale blue of complete desiccation. The temperature has crossed some threshold where the air itself seems to have changed phase, becoming less a medium of breath and more a substance to move through, to displace with each step and gesture. You find shade beneath an awning of striped canvas, the colors faded by seasons of such exposure, to the point where the original pattern survives only in the memory of those who first purchased it, in the records of transaction that exist somewhere in a merchant's cedarwood chest. The dusty, honeyed scent of saffron threads releasing their aroma in afternoon warmth reaches you from a nearby stall, where an old woman sells small packets of saffron from a folded cloth, each pinch measured by her thumbnail, the yellow stain on her skin attesting to years of this measurement, this repeated contact with what is valuable precisely because it is scarce, because it requires the hand collection of thousands of individual stigmas from thousands of individual crocus flowers in the brief season when they bloom and must be harvested before the sun degrades what the sun has called into being. Noon brings the arrival of a courier from Merv with news of silver price fluctuations. The packet he carries sealed with the mark of a banking house whose correspondence extend from the Persian Gulf to the ports of southern China. The courier has ridden through the night, his horse lathered and trembling in the stable yard, the animal receiving now the attention that the urgency of his journey postponed. The news of silver travels faster than silver itself, which is the purpose of couriers, which is the function of information in a system where goods require months to complete their journeys, but decisions about them must be made in days, in hours, in the compressed temporal window of a market that will not wait for certainty. Silver, much of it likely from Afghan mines, may have served as a standard medium of exchange, and fluctuations from Merv may concern this standard, this common measure against which the value of goods like silk from Chang'an and Lapis from Badakhshan could have been calculated, rendered commensurable in a language of weight and purity. The dull gleam of uncoined silver ingots stacked in a cedarwood chest appears in your imagination as you hear the courier's news, the metal not yet committed to any particular transaction, still potential, still capable of becoming any good that the market might offer, any service that might be purchased with its transferable promise of future value. The afternoon extends itself in the manner of afternoons in places where the difference between morning and evening matters less than the difference between sun and shade, between the exposed and the protected. You move through the market as the light begins to tilt toward the west, the shadows lengthening in proportion to the decline of the sun, the geometry of illumination reversing its morning pattern, the corners that held darkness now catching the last direct light, while the eastern surfaces cool into premature evening. Porcelain traveled westward in considerable quantities from Tang production centers, and you see it now in a stall where bowls are nested one within another in graduated sizes, the pale celadon surfaces seeming to emit their own subdued radiance, to compete with the daylight rather than merely reflect it. Glassware from Western factories competed with Chinese porcelain in Central Asian markets, and nearby a trader from Syria displays vessels of aquamarine transparency, their thin walls alive with the distortions of light passing through material shaped by blowing and spinning, by the human breath and skill that give form to what was once sand and alkali. The competition between these materials, between the ceramic and the vitreous, between the opaque and the transparent, proceeds not as argument but as juxtaposition, as the simultaneous availability of alternatives that permits choice without requiring decision, that presents options without imposing any particular selection. Spices from southern China and Southeast Asia entered the Western trade through Central Asian entrepots, and their presence makes itself known in the quarter where the aromatic merchants have gathered. The air here layered with complexities that resist identification, that merge into a general impression of elsewhere, of distance compressed into olfactory form. You pass bales of kasha bark, their curled scrolls like manuscripts in an unknown script, like the bark's own record of growth written in tissue and resin. Cardamom pods release their eucalyptus sharpness when a sack is shifted, when the accumulated pressure of weight upon weight cracks some fraction of the harvest and liberates what was sealed. Wool, particularly from Iranian plateau breeds, moved eastward as a primary Western export, and in the textile quarter you encounter it in forms ranging from raw fleece to finished carpets, the transformation of animal covering into human possession complete in some cases, still underway in others. A weaver from Nishapur works at a loom set up in the partial shelter of an archway, the warp threads stretched between beams that have held thousands of previous warps, that bear the polished patina of decades of friction, of the passage of shuttle and beater. The wool she weaves has travelled from the high pastures where sheep with fat tails, adapted to aridity, grow coats of remarkable fineness, where the shearing season marks the calendar as surely as any astronomical event, any solstice or equinox of religious significance. The carpet emerging under her hands shows the medallion design typical of her region, the geometry of central field and border that will be completed in weeks or months, depending on the fineness of knotting, the density of pile that determines both quality and duration of labor. You consider the sheep in their mountain pastures, unaware of the distances their coats will travel, the value they will accrue through washing and carding and spinning and dyeing and knotting, and all the transformations that intervene between the living animal and the object of commerce, the prestige item laid across a floor in Chang'an or Loyang, or some other eastern destination where the cold demands such covering, where the display of distant provenance carries social meanings beyond the merely practical. Gold from Byzantine and later Abbasid sources flowed toward China, and its presence in this market testifies to the continued operation of channels that politics might disrupt, but has not succeeded in closing, that warfare might complicate, but has not rendered impassable. You observe a money changer's scale, the delicate balance capable of registering differences invisible to the untrained eye, the weights themselves stored in a case of fitted compartments, each denomination marked with the symbols of its issuing authority, its guarantee of standard. The gold moves as coin, as ingot, as worked object whose artistic value adds to and sometimes exceeds its metallic worth. The reliquary, or the ceremonial vessel, or the piece of jewelry that travels as merchandise, but might arrive as gift, as tribute, as the material expression of diplomatic intention. The flow is not constant, not a steady stream, but rather a series of pulses, of movements concentrated in periods when the route is secure, when the authorities at either end, and along the way maintain sufficient order to make the risk calculable, to permit the investment of capital and effort that long-distance trade requires. Livestock, particularly horses from Fergana, represented significant trade value, and in the animal market you find them displayed, the distinctive breed known for size and endurance, for the capacity to carry armored riders across the distances that separate the zones of civilization, that make empire possible and also make it difficult, the logistical challenge of maintaining control across spaces that resist consolidation. A Fergana horse stands 16 hands at the withers, its coat the characteristic golden color that gives the breed its poetic name, its nostrils flaring at the unfamiliar smells of the market, the strange horses nearby, the human crowd that presses closer than step manners permit. The particular blue of highest grade Lapis comes to mind unbidden as you study the animal's eyes, the dark liquid surfaces that seem similarly depthless, similarly capable of drawing attention into themselves without returning it, without offering any purchase for interpretation. In a private chamber, Two partners divide profits from a consignment of Fergana horses sold in Baghdad. This transaction already completed, already history. The animals themselves perhaps dispersed to military stables or noble estates, their individual fates as various as the purposes to which such quality might be put. Sasanian silver vessels remained prestige items long after the Arab conquest, and you see them in the Antiquities Quarter, where objects acquire value through survival, through the accident of preservation that transforms the everyday of one era into the collectible of another. A ewer with the typical lobed body, its surface chased with scenes of royal hunt, the king identifiable by his enlarged scale relative to the attendants who surround him, the convention of importance expressed through size rather than position or attribute. The silver retains its whiteness despite centuries of handling, of polishing, of the chemical interactions with skin oils and atmospheric sulfurs that darken lesser pieces, that require the intervention of craftsmen to restore. Their continued circulation testifies to the persistence of aesthetic judgment across religious and political change, to the capacity of beauty to survive the systems that created it, to find new contexts of appreciation when the original context has dissolved into historical memory. Lapis lazuli had been traded to Mesopotamia since the 3rd millennium BCE, and this duration of movement, this continuity of exchange across 4,000 years and more, impresses itself upon you as you handle a bead in the jeweler's stall, the drill hole worn by the friction of countless suspension cords, by the wearing against skin and fabric across generations of ownership. Sumerian civilization in Lower Mesopotamia pioneered urban culture from the 4th to 2nd millennia BCE, and it was to the temples and palaces of this civilization that the first Lapis traveled, carried down from the Afghan highlands through Iran, through the intermediate territories that would take their own shape as cultures in the centuries that followed, that would develop their own claims to the goods that passed through their domains. The bead you hold might have been newly made, its drill hole fresh from the bow drill of the Balk workshop, or it might be ancient, its provenance untraceable, its history compressed into the wear patterns that only expert eyes can read, that the Sogdian merchants specialized in identifying and grading precious stones for distant markets would assess with the confidence of long training, of inherited knowledge passed from generation to generation, along with the goods themselves. Their presence in this caravanserai, though diminished from the dominance they once exercised, continues to mark the trade as they practice it, the particular expertise that made them indispensable intermediaries between the source of gems and their eventual consumers. You observe one such merchant examining a parcel of turquoise brought from Nishapur, his loop revealing the matrix patterns that determine quality, the spiderweb of darker inclusion that might enhance or diminish value depending on its configuration, on the standards of the market for which the stone is destined. His fingers move with the autonomy of long practice, separating, rotating, holding to the light, the gestures as ritualized as those of prayer, as the religious observances that punctuate his days and that have survived, among some Sogdian communities, the conversion to Islam, the adoption of the faith that brought new networks of connection even as it disrupted older ones. The slippery coolness of raw silk, thread running through the fingers like water returns to your awareness as you watch his hands, the analogous delicacy of touch required by both materials, the sensitivity to texture and weight that distinguishes the professional from the amateur, the merchant who lives by judgment from the traveler who buys as souvenir, as memory of passage. The day has progressed to that hour when the market begins its transition toward closure, the transactions that will conclude today concluding, those that will require tomorrow already anticipated in the arrangements of goods, in the provisional agreements that need only formal confirmation. After the market closes, merchants seal their strongboxes and record the day's transactions, the wooden boxes with their iron fittings locked against the night, against the possibility of disturbance that darkness brings even in places of relative security, even within the walls that define the Caravanserai's protected space. You watch a merchant from Dunhuang make entries in a ledger, the brush moving with the efficiency of habit, the characters forming with a speed that suggests thought and inscription as simultaneous processes, the calculation of amounts and the physical production of record as aspects of a single activity rather than sequential stages. The record will serve for reference, for the settlement of disputes, for the transmission of information to partners in distant cities who must know what has transpired here in order to make their own decisions, to adjust their own preparations for the goods that will reach them in weeks or months, that are already in motion toward them even as this entry is made. The strongbox contains the day's receipts, the silver and gold and the credit instruments that represent them, the documents of obligation that circulate as substitutes for specie, that economize on the physical movement of metal by substituting the promise of payment for payment itself. The merchant arranges the contents with methodical care, the larger ingots below, the smaller above, the documents in their separate compartment, the whole organized for rapid inventory, for the verification that partners or creditors might require, that legal process might demand. You observe this sealing as a small ceremony, as the punctuation that gives shape to commercial time, that divides one day of accumulation from the next, that marks the boundary between the public space of the market and the private space of rest and preparation. Evening arrives with the same gradualness as the morning, the light complexifying rather than simply diminishing, the shadows pooling, and then dispersing as the source of illumination shifts from the direct sun to the diffuse sky, to the reflected light of clouds and atmosphere that persists after the sun itself has descended below the horizon. You find yourself in the courtyard as the first stars become visible, their appearance timed to the fading of competing brightness, the gradual surrender of day that permits these distant points to assert their presence, to resume the patterns that human observation has named and narrated, that have guided travelers across the trackless expanses of desert and ocean. The chamber is lit by a single lamp, the flame steady in the absence of draught, the wick trimmed to consume oil with reasonable efficiency, the light falling on faces that have known each other through years of collaboration, through the shared risks and rewards of a trade that depends on trust, extended across distances where enforcement is difficult, where personal reputation serves as the ultimate guarantee of obligation. The particular blue of highest grade Lapis appears in a small box on the table between them, a sample brought for discussion, for the planning of a future venture that will take the partner who travels to Badakhshan, to the mines where the extraction continues in tunnels that follow the seams through rock of extraordinary hardness, through conditions that limit the season of work to the months when the passes are open, when supplies can reach the miners, and their product can descend to the markets where value is realized. The conversation proceeds in the measured tones of men who have learned that haste in calculation leads to error, that the careful review of figures, of the quantities and prices and expenses and commissions that enter into any transaction, rewards patience with accuracy, with the mutual confidence that permits continued association. Silver, much of it from Afghan mines, served as a standard medium of exchange, and the profits are denominated in this standard, though they may be held as goods in transit, as credits extended to buyers, as the various forms of wealth that circulate through the trading world without ever achieving the simplicity of mere metal, of stacked ingots awaiting their purpose. The lamp consumes its oil, the flame sinking slightly before the wick is adjusted, the light restored to its former level, the conversation continuing in the circle of visibility that it defines, beyond which the chamber extends into obscurity, into the spaces that sleep will claim, that the night will hold in its own manner, its own register of existence. You are present at this division as witness rather than participant, as the observer whose role is not to intervene, but to understand, to carry the image of this private transaction into the larger narrative of which it forms a part, the ongoing story of what moves along the routes, of what the merchants carry and why it matters, of the silk and silver and lapis that connect the workshops of Chang'an with the bazaars of Baghdad, the mines of Badakhshan with the temples of Sumer, the pastures of Fergana with the stables of every city, where the horse defines mobility, defines power, defines the possible against the constraint of distance. The particular blue of highest grade lapis remains with you as a retinal impression, as the afterimage of color that persists you are lying still upon the raised platform where travelers sleep, and through the unshuttered window the darkness holds a quality of held breath, of accumulated stillness that precedes the first movements of the working day. The stars of early morning have begun their withdrawal toward the western horizon, and the eastern sky above the paper-producing quarter shows the faintest separation of color from the general darkness, a dilution of black into something that resembles the gray of pulp suspended in water, the gray of fiber beginning its transformation from cloth to page. Somewhere beyond the walls of this lodging, perhaps 3 streets distant, perhaps 5, the lime pits of the paper workshops have already received their night's soaking of hemp and flax, and the torn remnants of worn garments, the recycled textile rags that will become the substance of correspondence and record and poetry in the months to come, in the years when the reputation of Samarkand paper spreads throughout the caliphate and beyond. The air in your chamber carries the faint mineral sharpness that drifts from those pits when the wind moves in a particular direction, the alkaline sting of lime water on skinned knuckles that the workers know intimately, that they wash away in the channels of running water descending from the high ground and dividing the quarter into sections of related activity. You have not yet seen these channels in daylight, but you have heard them described by the merchant who shares your evening meal, who speaks of the abundance of water that favors paper manufacture in this city, of the dry climate that completes what water begins, that draws moisture from finished sheets with a thoroughness impossible in more humid regions closer to the sea. Samarkand, he said, repeating the name as one repeats an incantation, received this craft following the Battle of Talas in 751 CE, when Chinese papermakers captured they were reportedly employed in establishing local production, their knowledge transferred across the boundary of language and allegiance by the practical necessity of making something useful from what the earth and human ware provide. You turn upon your side, and the wool of the blanket shifts against your shoulder with a soft resistance. The particular hollow rhythm of wooden stampers felt through the feet before the ears has not yet begun. The hour belongs to soaking and waiting, to the patience that precedes mechanical action. But you imagine it already, placing yourself forward into the approaching day, standing at the edge of a workshop court where the first grey light discovers the surface of water in stone basins, where the shapes of bundled fiber emerge from darkness like thoughts still unformed, still requiring the labor of articulation. The sound of stampers pounding fiber became characteristic of paper-producing quarters in the decades after that distant battle, after the transfer of knowledge that connected this city to the origins of the craft in lands farther east, and now it marks the hours as surely as the call to prayer marks them elsewhere, a secular rhythm of production overlapping with and extending beyond the sacred divisions of the day. Dawn arrives without announcement, a gradual accumulation of visibility that reveals first the nearest objects, and then those farther off, the dome of a neighboring structure, the minaret that serves as reference point for orientation, the line of poplars indicating the course of the water channel you have been told to follow to reach the quarter where the paper workshops of Samarkand concentrate their activity. You rise and dress in garments appropriate to a visitor of scholarly purpose, the loose coat and trousers that permit movement among vats and presses, and you make your way through corridors of increasing activity, past the kitchen where bread is being prepared for the morning meal, past the stable where horses shift and stamp in anticipation of fodder. The city receives you into its streets with the indifference of a place occupied with its own purposes, its own perpetual circulation of goods and labor, and the human energy sustaining both. The paper quarter announces itself first through smell, the alkaline sting of lime water now present in the general atmosphere, carried on the moisture rising from the channel you walk beside. Workers pass you carrying bundles of soaked material, their forearms marked with the pale residue of handling, their movements efficient with repetition. You are standing at the entrance to a narrow lane where the buildings press closer together, where the upper stories project sufficiently to create a continuous partial shade. And around you the merchants are unloading their cargoes of raw material, hemp from the fields to the north, flax from more distant cultivation, the collected rags of a society that wears cloth until it fragments and then finds new purpose in fragmentation. The cold air moves across your face, though the cold is relative, a morning chill that will dissipate as the sun climbs, and the dry climate asserts its character. The dry climate and abundant water supply that favored paper manufacture from the first establishment of the craft here, continuing to favor it through the generations of family enterprises that guard their technical knowledge with the natural caution of those who possess something valuable and replicable. By mid-morning, the rhythmic thump of stampers fills the narrow lanes, and you feel it indeed through your feet before your ears identify and locate it, a vibration transmitted through packed earth and stone foundation, through the wooden structures that lean toward each other across the passage of air. This particular hollow rhythm derives from the mechanism that raises and releases heavy wooden heads, that pounds the soaked fiber into the slurry from which sheets will be formed, the pulp-grey slurry pouring across a screen like slow liquid cloud when the moment of formation arrives. You have approached a workshop whose door stands open in invitation, or at least in acknowledgement that observation cannot damage what skill and secrecy protect. And within the courtyard you see the arrangement that repeats throughout this quarter, the vats in their descending order of process, the frames stacked against walls, the press that will receive the formed sheets and squeeze from them the excess water that would otherwise prevent proper drying. A master lifts a newly formed sheet from its screen, judging its weight and texture with a gesture so practiced it requires no conscious attention, his fingers spread at the corners, his eyes assessing the evenness of fiber distribution, the absence of lumps or tears, or the thin spots that indicate insufficient slurry or hasty workmanship. He does not speak to you, nor does he need to. The demonstration is complete in itself, the transfer of knowledge occurring through observation rather than instruction, as the Chinese papermakers reportedly conveyed their methods through demonstration and supervised practice rather than written manual. The sheet he examines catches the light that falls through the opening in the roof, and for a moment it holds a translucency that will vanish with drying and sizing, a temporary luminosity that reveals the individual fibers suspended in their new arrangement, the former hemp or flax or cotton rag, transformed into something that did not exist before human intention intervened. Apprentices move in the background of this scene, their youth apparent in their quickness, their willingness to perform the tasks of preparation and completion that surround the master's central work of judgment and correction. You observe them stacking pressed sheets in the drying loft, where roof vents draw the summer air that moves in currents designed by architectural experience, by the accumulated wisdom of workshops that have operated through the centuries since the craft's establishment. The sheets they handle retain enough moisture to be flexible, to risk damage from careless pressure, and they arrange them with the spacing that permits air to circulate, that permits the dry climate to perform its essential function in the sequence of production. Samarkand paper gained reputation as the finest quality in the Islamic world through such attention to each stage, through the recognition that excellence accumulates from the accumulation of adequate moments rather than from any single spectacular intervention. The loft where the apprentices work receives light from openings positioned to maximize exposure without direct sun, and the sheets laid there slowly change in character, losing the saturated grey of wet fibre and approaching the warmer tone of finished material, the colour that will receive ink without spreading, that will preserve the sharpness of scribble intention. Sizing with starch or glue prevents ink bleeding on finished sheets, and you observe the preparation of this sizing in a corner of the courtyard, the heating and stirring and testing for consistency that represents another guarded element of workshop knowledge, another component of the family enterprise with its inherited techniques and its boundaries of disclosure. The master who lifted the sheet from its screen appears again in this area, dipping a finger into the warm mixture, drawing it out to observe the film that forms as it cools, the viscosity that will determine how deeply the sizing penetrates the fiber structure, how completely it seals the surface against the liquid aggression of ink. The morning advances in increments of temperature and light, and you find yourself seated upon a low bench where a merchant from Baghdad has also arranged himself, a man whose clothing and bearing indicate prosperity and the confidence that prosperity permits. He has brought with him a sample book, a collection of sheets from various sources intended for comparison and selection, and you watch as he inspects it, noting the even fiber distribution with the same attention the workshop master applied to his own production, the same discernment of quality that distinguishes the professional trader from the occasional purchaser. His fingers move across the surface with a lightness that suggests long acquaintance, the accumulated memory of thousands of such examinations, and he murmurs appreciation or reservation in tones too low for you to distinguish the words, though the direction of his judgment seems favorable, inclined toward acquisition and the further transport of Samarkand paper throughout the Caliphate and beyond. The particular hollow rhythm of wooden stampers continues beneath this scene of evaluation, a subsonic accompaniment to the higher frequencies of negotiation and description. You are aware of your own breathing in a manner that occurs only in states of extended quiet observation, the inhalation and exhalation matching themselves unconsciously to some larger tempo, some periodicity of the place extending beyond individual activity to encompass the collective duration of the workshop, the quarter, the city itself. The stiff crackle of properly dried paper being flexed for the quality test interrupts this meditation, the merchant from Baghdad bending a corner of his selected sample to assess its resilience, the sound of fiber structure resisting, and then yielding, the audible signature of adequate beating and proper drying and correct proportion in the original mixture. The afternoon extends the warmth that began at midday, and the workshop moves through its phases with the inevitability of organic process, the cleaning of vats that follows the exhaustion of prepared material, the setting in order of tools for tomorrow's production, the gradual deceleration that corresponds to the decline of adequate light for fine work. You observe this conclusion with the satisfaction of witnessing a completed cycle, the return to conditions that permit renewal. The workers move with the looseness of fatigue, with the slight extravagance of gesture that comes when exactitude is no longer required, and their voices rise in frequency and variety, exchanging the observations suppressed during hours of concentrated labor, the gossip and complaint and brief narrative that restore social connection after the isolation of individual task. You withdraw from the workshop as the light becomes horizontal, as shadows extend across the courtyard and the channels of water reflect sky rather than revealing bottom. The paper quarter empties in waves of departure, the workers returning to dwellings scattered through the city, the apprentices to their barracks or family residences, the masters to the households where their status permits some comfort and distinction. The sound of stampers pounding fiber diminishes to isolated instances as the last batches receive their final processing, and then ceases entirely, leaving an auditory space that the ear must readjust to occupy, that seems at first almost abnormal in its absence of mechanical rhythm. The evening meal in the Caravanserai returns you to the company of fellow travelers, to the exchange of information that constitutes the social life of transient populations. The merchant from Baghdad occupies a position of honor, his purchases of the day having been substantial enough to warrant respect, and he speaks of the even fiber distribution he observed, of the quality marks and producer seals that authenticate origin and justify the premium prices that Samarkand paper commands in distant markets. Paper gradually displaced papyrus and parchment in Abbasid administrative use, he notes, and the shift to paper facilitated the expansion of bureaucratic record-keeping, the multiplication of documents that accompanies the elaboration of governance, the preservation of decision and delegation that makes complex administration possible across distance and duration. His voice carries the certainty of one who has profited from this transition, who has positioned himself at the intersection of technological change and institutional need. You listen with the partial attention that permits simultaneous reflection, your mind returning to the sensory particulars of the day now concluding, the pulp-grey slurry pouring across a screen like slow liquid cloud, the alkaline sting of lime water on skinned knuckles that you observed on worker forearms, the stiff crackle of properly dried paper being flexed for the quality test. These impressions accumulate without urgency, settling into the memory with the gradual consolidation that sleep will complete, that the rest and preparation of night will transform into accessible recollection. The particular blue of highest grade Lapis has faded from your retinal awareness, replaced by the warmer tones of fiber and wood, and the mineral whites of lime and sizing, the palette of productive labor rather than extracted ornament. The darkness outside the Caravanserai has achieved that depth which permits star emergence, and through the same unshuttered window that admitted dawn you observe the first points of light in the cooling sky. The dry climate that favors paper manufacture favors also this clarity of astronomical observation, this absence of atmospheric moisture that would blur and diminish the celestial display. You consider the parallel between the preservation of human record and the preservation of cosmic appearance, both dependent upon conditions of material stability, both vulnerable to the interventions of moisture and time and the general entropy that attends all organized form. The workshops of Samarkand resist this entropy through continuous production, through the daily renewal that replaces what is consumed with what is newly made. The family enterprises with their guarded technical knowledge, perpetuating themselves through generation and apprenticeship, and the social arrangements that bind skill to community. The blanket receives you again with its familiar texture, its slight roughness that becomes comfortable through habituation. The sound of stampers pounding fiber persists in auditory memory as a rhythm you can almost summon at will, a bodily recollection of vibration transmitted through feet and spine to the inner ear. The Chinese papermakers captured at Talas in 751 CE could not have anticipated the extension of their knowledge across this distance of time and geography. The reputation of Samarkand paper as the finest quality in the Islamic world, the export throughout the Caliphate, and beyond that their initial instruction made possible. History operates through such contingencies, through the capture and transfer that follows battle, through the employment of skilled prisoners, in establishing local production that serves purposes far removed from the conflict that enabled the initial contact. Your breathing slows in the approach to sleep, and the images of the day lose their sequential organization, floating freely in the mind as the pulp-grey slurry floats upon its vat before the screen collects and concentrates it. Colored and marbled papers, developed as specialty products in workshops of sufficient sophistication, you recall, the extension of basic technique into decorative elaboration that serves markets of aesthetic rather than merely utilitarian demand. The paper industry supported related trades in ink, pens, and bookbinding, creating an ecology of craft that extends beyond any single workshop to encompass the material culture of written communication in its entirety. You have seen evidence of this ecology in the quarter, the ink sellers adjacent to paper merchants, the binders with their collections of finished leather and thread, the pen makers shaping reed and feather with the same attention to material quality that the paper masters apply to fiber. Samarkand surrounds you in darkness, the city with its dry climate and abundant water supply, its position on routes that connect the production of one region to the consumption of another, its history of receiving and transforming, and then transmitting what originates elsewhere. The alkaline sting of lime water on skinned knuckles belongs to the workers who will resume their labor before your own awakening, who will return to the lime pits and the vats and the screens while you remain in the temporary suspension of travel, the between state that characterizes the Caravanserai existence. The stars complete their patterns overhead, and the air carries only those sounds that belong to the hours between dusk and dawn, to the period of rest and preparation that makes the activities of the market possible, that sustains the human energy which the trade consumes and renews in its perpetual circulation. Production involved pulping fibers, forming sheets on wire screens, pressing and drying, and this sequence will repeat with the regularity that defines craft, transforming individual effort into collective continuity, the guarded technical knowledge of family enterprises persisting through demonstration and imitation, and the slow accumulation of embodied skill. You drift upon the edge of sleep, and the boundaries of immediate sensation dissolve into the larger field of remembered and imagined experience. The workshop with its roof vents that draw the summer air, the drying loft where apprentices stack pressed sheets, the channels of water that divide the quarter into sections of related activity, all persist as architectural presences in the mind, spaces that contain the possibility of return, of further observation and deeper understanding. Finished paper was sorted by quality and marked with producer seals, and you imagine the seal of the workshop you visited, its impression in wax or ink upon the wrapper that encloses a bundle for transport, the authentication that travels with the material to distant destinations where the reputation of Samarkand paper must be verified against competing claims, against the products of other cities that aspire to comparable recognition. The afterimage of color that persists when you close your eyes has shifted now to the warm tones of fiber and wood, to the mineral whites and the subtle variations of gray that characterize the intermediate stages of paper manufacture. The particular blue of highest grade Lapis belongs to yesterday, to the previous chapter of your journey, and tomorrow may bring other colors, other materials, other demonstrations of human capacity to transform the substances that nature provides. For now, in the darkness of the Caravanserai chamber, in the held breath of the hour before deepest night. You rest in the knowledge of processes witnessed and partially understood, of the continuous production that surrounds and sustains individual existence. The paper-making technology that spread to Samarkand following the Battle of Talas in 751 CE, continuing its operation through your own present moment, connecting you to that distant event through the medium of craft and the persistence of useful knowledge across the disruptions of political change and the migrations of population and faith. Sleep arrives as the lime pits receive their next soaking, as the cycle prepares to repeat, as the city of Samarkand maintains its nocturnal vigil of production and preparation, and the gradual approach of another dawn when the rhythmic thump of stampers will fill the narrow lanes and the paper quarter will resume its characteristic animation, its distinctive contribution to the material and intellectual life of the Islamic world and the regions beyond that receive what it produces, that preserve and extend the possibilities of recorded thought which this craft enables. The citadel rises above the older quarters of Samarkand, where the paper quarter still rests in darkness, and you are climbing the worn stone, steps toward an upper room where a single lamp has burned since dusk. The brass chill of an astrolabe, held too long in ungloved hands, awaits the astronomer who prepares his evening measurements, his fingers tracing the Retes star pointers, while the city spreads below in layers of shadow and faint lamplight. Around you, the stairwell carries the dry, faintly metallic smell of mathematical dust, ink, brass polish, and aged parchment that clings to every surface where scholars have passed. The particular quality of lamplight on vellum, warm and uneven, casting shadows from the hand, will soon illuminate the work that occupies this room through the hours until dawn. You enter as the astronomer completes his preliminary adjustments, his instrument catching the last visible light of Venus where it hovers above the western wall. The Abbasid period, designated the golden age of Islam in later scholarship, established the patterns of courtly support that make this scene possible, though the political center has shifted, and Samarkand now claims its portion of the astronomical heritage. He does not look up from his task, accustomed to the presence of assistants and visitors who move through these chambers as natural extensions of the observational program. His thumb rests upon the rule, sliding the plate to match the latitude of this city, which sits at a position allowing observation of stars inaccessible from Baghdad, that older capital where the House of Wisdom once gathered texts from every conquered territory. You stand aside, near the arched window where the evening air moves across your face with the cooling weight of desert transition, and you observe how the astronomer's movements follow a rhythm established through decades of practice. The assistant sits at a lower table, his reed pen suspended above a sheet of prepared vellum. The silence of a high room at night, broken only by the scratch of reed pen on paper, settles between spoken exchanges as the astronomer calls out numbers and the assistant repeats them before recording. He checks against the tables of Al-Khwarizmi, those coordinate sets computed in Baghdad during the early 9th century, when the Caliph Al-Mamun commissioned the first systematic star catalogues. The tables travel with scholars, copied and recopied, annotated with corrections accumulated through generations of use. You notice how the assistant's hand pauses, how he turns to a marginal note in his own copy, comparing two values before selecting the figure he will enter. The visitor arrives without announcement, as is customary among those whose correspondence has preceded their arrival by weeks of caravan travel. He carries a satchel of papers from Baghdad, where the primary center for art, culture, and research maintains its collections despite the political fragmentation that has distributed authority across multiple courts. You observe him set down a flask of pomegranate wine, the dark liquid catching lamplight like a secondary instrument of observation, and he pours 3 cups without asking permission, establishing the collaborative tone that governs these encounters. They discuss discrepancies in planetary observations, the visitor citing measurements taken at the observatory of Baghdad, the astronomer countering with his own determinations from Samarkand's position. The conversation moves through technical vocabulary with the ease of men who have devoted their lives to precision, and you stand at the window where the stars themselves offer silent commentary upon human disagreement. The dry, faintly metallic smell of mathematical dust mingles now with the tart fragrance of the wine as cups are refilled and set aside. You turn from the window to watch the visitor spread a sheet of calculations across the central table, his finger tracing a column of lunar elongations where his figures diverge from those recorded in Samarkand. The astronomer listens without interruption, his astrolabe resting upon its cushion, and he asks only for the date and instrumental configuration that produced the Baghdad measurement. Khurasan and Transoxania developed as secondary centers of learning and literature, and this region later formed the core of the Iranian Renaissance. So the exchange between these observers represents not merely personal correction, but the synchronization of an expanding network. Before morning prayer, calculations continue. The length of the solar year, the precession of equinoxes. The assistant has opened a second lamp, and the particular quality of lamplight on vellum, warm and uneven, casting shadows from the hand, now fills the room with doubled illumination that reduces the contrast between ink and surface. You move to observe the astronomer's working sheet, where he computes the tropical year through comparison of solstice observations across multiple years, his notation compact and abbreviated, comprehensible only to those trained in the same conventions. The precession of equinoxes, that slow drift discovered by Hipparchus and refined through Islamic observation, requires comparison of contemporary positions against ancient records, a temporal extension of the network that connects observers separated by centuries as well as geography. You return to the window where the sky has shifted, Venus descended below the wall, other stars emerging in patterns that the astrolabes retain codes in brass geometry. The Arabic prefix al in scientific terms, algebra, alchemy, alcohol, alkali, reflects this period's influence upon the vocabulary of European learning, though here in the original context, such designations require no special marking, being simply the articles of ordinary speech. The astronomer joins you briefly, pointing toward the horizon where dawn will eventually break, identifying a star whose meridian passage he intends to measure before the sky pales. His finger extends with the same precision that guides his instrument, and you sense the continuity between bodily gesture and mechanical operation that characterizes skilled practice. The dry, faintly metallic smell of mathematical dust seems stronger near the window, perhaps drawn by the temperature differential, perhaps merely your attention shifting to notice what has been present throughout. The call to prayer will come, but not yet, and the interval belongs to computation. You observe the assistant preparing fresh sheets, scraping errors from used surfaces for reuse, the particular quality of lamplight on vellum, warm and uneven, casting shadows from the hand, revealing the texture of the prepared skin where previous inscriptions have been diminished but not erased. Astronomical observation served practical needs in navigation, agriculture, and religious timing, and the determination of Qibla direction, that orientation toward Mecca required in prayer, depends upon accurate celestial coordinates. The astronomer returns to his table, the visitor resumes his seat, and you remain at the periphery where observation of their observation becomes possible, where the metastructure of scholarly practice reveals itself through accumulated detail. A physician from Merv enters without the visitor's preliminary courtesy, known to the household through previous consultation, and he settles at a side table to consult case notes, preparing a compound remedy according to Galenic principles. You turn to observe this parallel labor, understanding that the room serves multiple functions, that the court's patronage supports scholars with salaries, instruments, and libraries across disciplines that modern categories would separate. His materials differ from the astronomical apparatus: mortar and pestle, small ceramic jars, a folding board of pharmacological reference, but the concentration resembles what you have witnessed at the astrolabe. Medical knowledge combined Greek, Persian, Indian, and local traditions, and the physician's preparations incorporate substances from the silk routes that converge upon Merv, from the Indian Ocean ports that connect with Basra, from the local gardens where indigenous herbs maintain their reputations. The astronomer completes his meridian observation, calling out the final figures of this sequence, and the assistant records them with the same care applied to earlier entries. You note how star tables, Zij, required systematic observation and mathematical calculation, how the accumulation of such tables across centuries represents one of the most extensive scientific collaborations in human history. The visitor from Baghdad rouses himself from partial slumber, refreshed by the wine or merely by the interval of rest, and he compares his own copy of a critical table with the version held in Samarkand. Ptolemaic models were transmitted, criticized, and modified in Islamic scholarly circles, and their discussion now turns upon a particular inequality in the epicycle deferent ratio, a technical refinement that the visitor attributes to observation and the astronomer to computational convenience. You do not follow the mathematics entirely, but you perceive the structure of their disagreement, the respect that permits sustained contestation, the shared commitment to eventual resolution. The physician from Merv continues his preparations, adding measured portions to a compound whose color shifts through stages you cannot name. The particular quality of lamplight on vellum, warm and uneven, casting shadows from the hand, now supplemented by the glow of a brazier where water warms for extraction. The dry, faintly metallic smell of mathematical dust acquires herbal overlays, the sharpness of saffron, the heavy sweetness of opium preparation, the resinous undertone of frankincense from the southern trade. You move between these stations, observing the room as an integrated space where astronomical and medical practice coexist under the common roof of court patronage. Libraries accumulated manuscripts through purchase, copying, and diplomatic gift, and the volumes shelved along the eastern wall include texts in Syriac, Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit, awaiting translators whose work extends the accessible corpus. The assistant completes his transcription and begins the verification, reading back each entry while the astronomer follows against his working notes. You attend to this process, understanding that error detection operates through redundancy, through the expenditure of labor upon confirmation, through the social arrangement that makes such expenditure sustainable. Scholarly networks connected Central Asian cities with Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo, and the corrections recorded tonight will enter correspondence that travels these routes, that prompts response and further refinement. The visitor contributes from his own experience, citing an observation from Damascus that bears upon their current difficulty, extending the network momentarily into your awareness of its geographic extent. Mathematics advanced particularly in algebra and trigonometric methods, and the astronomer's current problem requires both the algebraic manipulation of unknown quantities, the trigonometric reduction of spherical to planar approximation. You return to the window where the sky has begun its subtle brightening, the stars maintaining visibility but losing the crystalline separation of full darkness. The astronomer acknowledges this transition, directing the assistant to conclude the current sequence rather than initiate new observations. Astrolabes, armillary spheres, and sundials were manufactured for observational programs, and you observe upon a side shelf an armillary sphere of smaller scale than the fixed instruments of major observatories, suitable for demonstration and instruction, its nested rings demonstrating the theoretical structure that observation verifies. The physician from Merv seals his preparation in a glazed jar, labeling it with patient name and dosage schedule, his consultation complete. The visitor repacks his satchel, the discussion having reached a provisional settlement, points of disagreement identified for future correspondence, agreements noted for incorporation in shared copies. You observe the ritual of departure, the mutual assurances of respect, the appointment of next meeting should their routes converge again. Baghdad, founded 762 CE, became the primary center for art, culture, and research, and the visitor carries this prestige in his bearing even as he acknowledges the particular advantages of Samarkand's position. The dry, faintly metallic smell of mathematical dust has permeated his clothing as it has yours, the occupational signature of spaces like this one. The physician departs without ceremony, his jar secured in his traveling pack, his case, notes, folded into the same container. You remain as the room empties, as the assistant extinguishes one lamp and shields the other against the growing daylight. The night ends with the call to prayer as the astronomer closes his brass instrument case, the sound of the latch coinciding with the first amplification from the muezzin below. You stand at the window where the city emerges from darkness, the paper quarter still quiet, but soon to resume its characteristic animation, its distinctive contribution to the material and intellectual life that connects these regions. You descend the stairwell where the dry, faintly metallic smell of mathematical dust lingers less strongly, replaced by the mineral coolness of stone and the distant suggestion of bread from the kitchens below. The citadel releases you into streets where dawn has established sufficient clarity for movement, where the astronomer and his assistant have preceded you toward their rest, where the visitor from Baghdad will soon depart with the caravan that waits at the eastern gate. Samarkand's position allowed observation of stars at latitudes inaccessible from Baghdad, and this geographical fact has structured the night you have observed, has determined the particular contributions that this city makes to the network of Islamic scholarship. You walk slowly, allowing the impressions of the night to settle, the brass chill of an astrolabe held too long in ungloved hands still memory upon your own palms, the particular quality of lamplight on vellum, warm and uneven, casting shadows from the hand, still visible when you close your eyes against the strengthening day. The streets widen as you approach the commercial district, the silence of a high room at night, broken only by the scratch of reed pen on paper, receding into the auditory texture of morning. Court patronage supported scholars with salaries, instruments, and libraries, and this support manifests in the prosperity you observe around you, in the quality of construction, in the presence of imported goods from the Caravanserais. The dry, faintly metallic smell of mathematical dust has been your companion through the night, but now the ordinary odors of urban life assert their claim. The baking bread, the animal presence, the irrigation channels that run along certain streets. You move without destination, the observer of a city that does not require your purpose, that continues its functions regardless of your attention. The paper quarter begins its awakening, the particular quality of lamplight on vellum, warm and uneven, casting shadows from the hand, giving way to the diffuse northern light that enters through workshop windows. You observe the first workers arriving, the watermarks being aligned, the pulp preparation resumed from yesterday's interrupted process. The dry, faintly metallic smell of mathematical dust shares the air now with the vegetal density of macerated fiber, the wet clay of fresh formation. You stand at the threshold of a workshop where a copyist has already begun his day, his lamp unnecessary but still present, his vellum prepared with the same care that you observed in the astronomer's assistant. The morning advances, and you find yourself walking toward the madrasa where public instruction will soon commence, where the knowledge preserved in last night's consultations transmits to students who will carry it forward. You enter the courtyard where water plays in a central basin, the sound replacing the silence of a high room at night, broken only by the scratch of reed pen on paper, with a continuous murmur that accompanies reflection. Students gather in groups, their conversation animated by the topics of the coming lesson, their youth contrasting with the mature expertise you observed in the citadel. The dry, faintly metallic smell of mathematical dust will reach them later, in the rooms where advanced study occurs, but here the atmosphere carries spring vegetation, the freshness of early day, the residual coolness of night stone. A lecturer passes, his arms loaded with texts, and you follow at distance to the classroom where he will unfold his materials upon a low desk. You take position near the rear, where observers customarily stand, where the particular quality of lamplight on vellum, warm and uneven, casting shadows from the hand, filters through high windows in beams that illuminate dust motes and the ascending gestures of explanation. The dry, faintly metallic smell of mathematical dust permeates this space too, accumulated through decades of scholarly habitation, inseparable from the function of the room. The lecture commences with invocation, with the positioning of textual authority, with the slow unfolding of argument that characterizes traditional pedagogy. You attend without full comprehension, your presence that of witness rather than participant, your attention distributed between the speaker's words and the responses they elicit from students. You perceive the embodied transmission of knowledge, the way that verbal description preserves physical practice across generations and distances, the way that Samarkand's position allowed observation of stars at latitudes inaccessible from Baghdad, becomes meaningful only when incorporated into bodily skill. The morning passes in this manner, the lecture concluding with assignment, with the dispersal of students to individual study, with your own emergence into courtyards now fully warmed by sun. You accept the offering of a fruit seller, the pomegranate's interior revealing the seeds that will stain your fingers, that connect you through consumption to the same fruit whose wine facilitated last night's astronomical discussion. The dry, faintly metallic smell of mathematical dust recedes before the immediate sweetness, the juice upon your lip, the satisfaction of simple need after hours of observation. The afternoon offers choice among multiple destinations, and you find yourself returning toward the citadel, drawn by the expectation that the astronomer may have risen, that the cycle of observation prepares to renew. You climb the familiar stairs, finding the room transformed by daylight, its contents visible now in their material particularity, the worn patches on the carpet, the scratches upon the instrument case, the accumulation of marginal notes upon every available surface. You stand at the window where the astronomer stood, looking upon the city that extends in all directions, that connects through its commerce and its scholarship with the wider world of Islamic civilization. The dry, faintly metallic smell of mathematical dust has weakened in the daytime ventilation, but you know it will strengthen again as lamps are lit, as the evening's work commences. You remain at the window as shadows lengthen, as the first star becomes visible in the darkening east, as the cycle you witnessed last night prepares to repeat with variations that experience and continued observation will introduce. The eastern gate of Afrasiab stands open in the last darkness before dawn, and you are standing just within its shadow, where the torch of a caravan master gutters against the remaining night. His name is Bahram, and he has led this route 11 times before, though never so early in the season as this. You watch him move his finger down a manifest written on coarse paper, murmuring quantities to himself, while his breath shows pale in the cold air. The gate guard waits with his own ledger, rubbing warmth into his ink-stained fingers. Bahram, 11 times. The the eastern gate of Afrasiab. The cold, clean air of earliest morning lies undisturbed upon the road, before dust rises from the passage of hooves and wheels to obscure the distances. You feel it move across your face, carrying the faint mineral scent of the irrigation channel that runs parallel to the wall, its surface black and still in this hour, before the sky begins its change. Somewhere beyond the torch's reach, a donkey shifts its weight and the loaded pack saddle creaks, adjusting to the first steps of the day. The sound comes again and again as other animals sense the imminence of movement. The cold air, the creak of saddles, the eastern gate of Afrasiab, where departure precedes the day's heat to maximize animal endurance across the hours of labor ahead. Bahram finishes his verification and folds the manifest into his belt, and you follow him toward the assembled animals where loaders work by lamplight. They lift bales of Samarkand paper, each bundle wrapped in felt against moisture and abrasion, and settle them into panniers balanced across a broad-backed camel whose coat is matted with the season's shedding. Ingots of silver follow, dull rectangles that clink softly against one another, counted and recorded by a clerk who squats in the dust with his own smaller torch. A sealed packet of Lapis arrives last, passed hand to hand from the gatehouse where it has waited under guard, its blue contents destined for the workshop of a distant patron whose name Bahram does not speak aloud. You place your palm briefly against the packet as it passes, feeling the ridge of wax beneath its wrapping, the impressed seal still slightly warm from the proximity of human keeping. Bahram, Samarkand paper, the sealed packet of Lapis. The sky above the eastern gate of Afrasiab remains deep enough to hold stars in its upper reaches, though a thinning has begun along the horizon that you perceive rather than see directly, a quality of darkness becoming porous. The gate guard records the departure in his register, his brush moving with the deliberation of official practice, noting the leader's name and destination in characters that will be copied and filed, and perhaps consulted years hence if some dispute of ownership or inheritance requires evidence of this moment. He writes Bahram. He writes the road to China. He notes the date by 3 calendars, the Sogdian commercial reckoning predominant among them. The gate guard, his register. Bahram's name and destination, fixed in ink while the stars still hold. As the sky lightens, the column moves out, 2 by 2, across the wooden bridge over the irrigation channel, and you find yourself walking beside the lead camel as its padded feet find the planks and lose them again on the far side. The bridge creaks in its joints, a deeper voice than the saddles, sustained longer, and then the sound falls away behind as the road opens onto the plain. The young man who rides beside his father for the first time as a full partner, not apprentice, passes close enough that you see the set of his shoulders beneath a coat too heavy for the day that will come, the conscious stillness with which he holds his reins. His father does not look at him, speaking only to the animal between his knees, but the proximity itself constitutes acknowledgement, the space between their mounts measured and maintained with the precision of long negotiation. The wooden bridge, the irrigation channel, the young man and his father, partners now, moving east from Afrasiab. The gradual warming of light on the left shoulder comes as the sun clears the eastern hills, a sensation you notice only after several minutes of its accumulation, the cold fabric of your coat becoming merely cloth, then something that approaches comfort. The road surface shows its details more clearly now, ruts from previous passages, scattered dung drying to powder, the occasional fragment of broken pottery pressed into the earth by countless subsequent feet. The column stretches behind you, its length greater than you had estimated in the darkness, the last animal still descending from the bridge as the first approach the turn where the road begins its rise toward the mountains. The mountains themselves remain a line of snow, distant and constant, their peaks catching light that has not yet reached the plain. The gradual warming, the left shoulder, the line of snow upon the mountains. Caravans bound for China face the Pamir crossing in summer months, and Bahram has timed this departure to precede the worst heat, not merely for the endurance of his animals, but for the alignment of his arrival with the narrow window when snowmelt, timing, determines whether high passes are traversable. You hear him discuss this with a guide who joins the column at the first milestone, a man whose knowledge of seasonal pasture routes commands premium wages that Bahram counts into his palm without visible reluctance. The guide's face bears the weathering of altitudes, a particular dryness around the eyes, and his mount carries nothing but water bags and grain, reserves sufficient to sustain the party between known wells whose locations he claims to hold in memory, unmarked by any map. The Pamir crossing, summer months, the guide and his premium wages, his memory of wells. The taste of dry bread and sheep's cheese comes upon you as the column pauses for a brief ration, eaten in the saddle, washing it down with water that tastes of leather from the bag that contains it. You tear the bread with your teeth, working it soft against your palate before swallowing, the cheese releasing its faint sharpness gradually, almost as an afterthought. The water carries the vegetable memory of its container, a slight tannic edge that speaks of curing and storage, and you drink sparingly despite the dryness of the mouthfuls, knowing the distance to the next confirmed source. Around you, others perform the same actions with the same deliberation, the young man beside his father mirroring the older man's gestures with the unconscious exactitude of recent learning. Dry bread, sheep's cheese, water that tastes of leather, sustaining the body between the wells that the guide remembers. The city walls of Afrasiab recede behind as the road turns toward the mountains, visible now as a line of snow that defines the eastern horizon with increasing specificity, individual ridges becoming distinguishable from the general mass. You look back once, observing how the gate has diminished to a darker rectangle in a paler wall, how the towers that flanked your departure have lost their detail and become merely vertical, merely stone, merely left behind. The irrigation channel curves away southward, its service ending at the agricultural perimeter, and the road climbs now in earnest, the gravel looser underfoot, the camels adjusting their pace to the gradient with the patient wisdom of their kind. The city walls recede. The road turns. The mountains, visible now as a line of snow that waits beyond the intermediate ridges. You observe the distribution of essentials across the column. No single animal overburdened, the redundancy deliberate against the possibility of loss. The bales of Samarkand paper ride well, protected from the humidity that would otherwise warp their surfaces, their value lying in the prepared smoothness that awaits the copyist's brush in some eastern workshop. Silver ingots shift less comfortably, their density requiring constant readjustment of packing, and you watch a loader dismount to tighten a slipping strap, his fingers working quickly against the distraction of the animals shifting. The sealed packet of Lapis remains where you touched it, near the head of the column, its guardian never more than 3 paces distant. Water bags, grain reserves, the known wells that punctuate the unknown distances. The cold, clean air of earliest morning has yielded now to something more complex, the dust beginning its daily rise from the passage of hooves and wheels, though not yet thick enough to obscure the distances that still matter. You taste it at the back of your throat, mineral and organic together, the road itself becoming airborne in microscopic increments. The creak of loaded pack saddles continues, a rhythm established and maintained, each animal's gait producing its particular variation on the common theme, so that you could almost distinguish individuals by sound alone if you attended long enough. The young man's mount produces a lighter note, less burdened, its protest at the climbing road more frequent though less sustained. The cold air yields, the dust rises, the creak of saddles marks, each measured progression toward the mountains. Guides familiar with seasonal pasture routes commanded premium wages because their knowledge represented survival compressed into individual memory. and you watch Bahram's guide ride ahead now, his posture suggesting attention to ground features invisible to less practiced eyes. He stops occasionally, leaning to examine vegetation or the texture of soil exposed by recent erosion, and once he circles back to recommend a deviation that adds distance to avoid a slope he judges unstable with the season's meltwater. Bahram accepts this without argument, the premium wages purchasing not merely route knowledge, but the authority to alter plans in real time, the confidence to contradict the direct path for the safer one. The guide, his premium wages. The seasonal pastures he alone seems to perceive. Snowmelt timing determined whether high passes were traversable, and the guide's consultations with Bahram grow more frequent as the morning advances, their voices low, their gestures indicating elevations still days distant. You pass through a valley where the stream runs high and brown, its sources active above, and the guide dismounts to test the current with a staff, measuring depth against the known capacity of laden animals to ford. The crossing proceeds slowly, each camel encouraged by handlers who know the particular reluctance of their charges, the water cold enough to shock even through the protective layers of hide and hair. On the far bank, the column reforms with the patience of practice, no animal pressing forward, each waiting its place in the established order. Snowmelt timing, the high passes, the brown water of active sources. Return cargoes typically included silver, Western glassware, and medicinal substances. Though this column moves outward, its purpose delivery rather than acquisition, the return anticipated in a season Bahram does not yet name. You consider what will fill these same panniers in 18 months, the transformation of outbound to inbound that constitutes the commerce of the route, the silver you now carry eastward, perhaps returning westward in some altered form, worked and valued differently in different markets. The Western glassware that awaits in some warehouse, fragile and luminous, will travel with protections devised through generations of breakage and its prevention. Medicinal substances, dried and powdered and sealed, preserve their potency across the durations that geography imposes. Return cargoes, silver, Western glassware and medicinal substances, awaiting their future carriage. Letters of credit issued by Sogdian banking houses reduce the need to transport bullion, and you carry such a document yourself, folded into the lining of your coat, its value contingent upon networks of trust that extend far beyond the visible column. The silver ingots that accompany you represent partial payment, immediate liquidity for transactions where credit alone proves insufficient, the combination of systems allowing commerce to proceed at velocities that neither could achieve independently. Bahram carries similar instruments, you know, and perhaps the young man beside his father now holds his first, the transfer of financial responsibility accompanying the transfer of partnership status. Letters of credit, Sogdian banking houses. The reduction of bullion transport that enables greater velocity. Travelers carried identity documents and safe conducts for multiple political jurisdictions, and the gate guard's register at Afrasiab constituted merely the first of many recordings, each authority demanding its own validation, its own fee, its own temporal suspension of movement. You have seen your own documents, the seals accumulated like stratigraphy, each layer representing a negotiation completed, a permission obtained. The safe conducts specify routes as well as persons, deviations punishable by confiscation or worse, the multiple jurisdictions creating a patchwork of enforcements that the experienced traveler learns to navigate with the same attention applied to physical terrain. Identity documents, safe conducts, the multiple political jurisdictions that punctuate the road to China. The Eastern Road passed through Fergana, where additional pack animals could be procured, and you observe Bahram calculating his current capacities against the demands of the Pamir crossing that awaits beyond that intermediate staging. Some animals would be sold, their value recovered in local currency, Others purchase to replace the weakened, or to expand the column for the greater loads that altitude would prohibit. The guide speaks of pastures there, seasonal availability, the condition of stock after winter ranging, and Bahram listens with the particular attentiveness that premium wages purchase, weighing information against the constraints of his schedule and his commitments. Fergana, additional pack animals, the procurement that awaits in the intermediate valleys. The gradual warming of light on the left shoulder has intensified toward genuine heat as the sun ascends past the eastern hills, and you shed your heavier coat, folding it across the front of your saddle with the practiced economy of movement that long riding develops. The young man has done likewise. You notice, though his father retains his, perhaps from slower circulation, perhaps from some principle of consistency, that the younger partner has not yet earned the right to disregard. The road continues its climb, the vegetation thinning, the soil becoming stonier, the line of snow upon the mountains losing its morning pink and assuming the blue-white of direct illumination. The gradual warming, the left shoulder, the sun ascending past the hills that defined your departure. Kashgar marked the transition from Sogdian to Chinese cultural and political zones, still distant from your present position, but present in conversation as a landmark of categorical change, a threshold that travelers crossed with awareness of alteration more profound than the mere continuation of distance. Bahram speaks of it to his new partner, describing arrangements for lodging, for the exchange of correspondence, for the engagement of additional guides whose authority would supersede that of the current holder of premium wages. The young man listens with the stillness of one storing information against future necessity, his questions held until the telling pauses, then emerging with a precision that suggests preparation. Kashgar, the transition. The cultural and political zones that await beyond Fergana. The sounds of departure, loading cries, animal protests, creaking packs, have yielded to the different sounds of sustained transit, the column now sufficiently dispersed that individual voices arrive isolated, separated by distances of dust and absorption. You hear your own breathing, the rhythm of your mount's pace, the wind that rises with the elevation gained to move across your face with a freshness that recalls the earliest morning, though the hour has advanced well past that initial cold. Occasionally, a shout from Bahram or his guide carries forward, some adjustment required, some hazard noted, but these interruptions diminish as the road finds its day's equilibrium. Loading cries, animal protests. The creaking packs that marked each dawn at the eastern gate of Afrasiab, now replaced by the steadier music of maintained progress. Dunhuang served as the final major staging point before the Gansu corridor, and you hear it named now in planning conversations that look weeks ahead, the accumulation of stages that constitutes the mental map of experienced travelers. There, water would be secured in quantity, animals rested and assessed, the desert beyond studied through reports from recent crossings, the timing of entry calculated with reference to seasonal patterns that the guide professes to understand. The Gansu corridor itself represented constraint, a narrower passage where political control tightened and the multiple jurisdictions of your safe conducts would be examined with particular rigor. Dunhuang, the final staging. The Gansu corridor that leads toward the heartland. Total journey duration to Chang'an could extend to 18 months with winter layovers, the immobility imposed by snow and cold at the highest elevations, forcing pauses that Bahram has learned to incorporate rather than resist. You consider the duration as physical experience, the body accumulating days of saddle and nights of ground, the slow transformation of temporary into habitual, the road becoming a kind of residence. Some winter layovers involved established relationships, quarters rented or borrowed, integration into local economies that continued regardless of through traffic. Others demanded improvisation, resources stretched, patience tested by confinement and uncertainty. 18 months. Winter layovers. The total duration to Chang'an that extends beyond what initial departure can comprehend. Many travelers never completed the round trip, settling in intermediate cities where opportunity or exhaustion or attachment intervened against the original intention of return. You have heard such stories from Bahram in earlier hours, the names of men and women who departed with his previous columns and remained in Kashgar or Dunhuang or some unremarked oasis, their lives continuing in directions that the road had made possible but not predicted. The young man beside his father hears these narratives now, their significance perhaps obscure to him, the possibility of incomplete return merely abstract against the immediacy of his first partnership. Many travelers, the round trip uncompleted, settlement in intermediate cities that the road makes possible. The creak of loaded pack saddles continues as the afternoon begins its slow decline. The sun moving now toward your right shoulder, the warmth becoming variable as clouds form above the mountains, their bases dark with withheld precipitation. You feel the first suggestion of evening cold in the air that moves across your face, the daily cycle reasserting its pattern against the accumulated heat of transit. The guide has found a sheltered hollow where the column will rest, water seeping from a rock face sufficient for the animal's immediate needs, though the grain reserves must supplement what grazing the sparse vegetation provides. The creak of saddles, the evening cold, the sheltered hollow where the day's progress pauses. The city walls of Afrasiab have long since disappeared behind the curvature of the earth and the accumulated ridges of the road, their memory preserved only in the documents that record departure, in the calculations that measure distance from origin. You sit now with your back against stone, still warm from the sun's earlier attention, eating dry bread and sheep's cheese, washing it down with water that tastes of leather from the bag that has accompanied you through the hours since the eastern gate. Around you, others perform similar actions, the young man beside his father with his first partner's confidence, Bahram with his guide discussing tomorrow's route in voices lowered against the gathering darkness. Afrasiab, the eastern gate. The departure that precedes the day's heat to maximize animal endurance across the distances that remain. The mountains, visible now as a line of snow, have advanced no closer in perceptible terms, their scale defeating the apparent progress of the column, their promise of difficulty maintained at the same indefinite remove. Yet the road turns toward them with the certainty of water finding grade, each day's increment, accumulating toward the confrontation that altitude and season will determine. You wrap yourself in your coat against the cold that returns with the sun's departure, feeling the fabric settle around your shoulders, the weight of another night upon the road. The line of snow, the turning road. The confrontation that awaits in the heights where Bahram has traveled 11 times before, and where you now follow, through the gate before dawn, into the continuous life of departure that sustains the connections between the cities of the earth and the patience of those who endure the distances between them.